Welcome to Human Monsters. I want to preface this episode by saying that the actions of Jeffrey Lundgren and his cohorts are not reflective of the majority of Mormons. I was once a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The people I interacted with as a member were kind, law-abiding, and devoid of any inclination to commit the types of crimes with which Jeffrey Lundgren and his cult would be charged. Many people assume that the polygamist types who live in compounds in rural areas represent the Mormon majority. I've heard all about the 14-year-old brides. The truth is, those people are fanatics who have distorted and refashioned the church's beliefs to justify immoral and illegal behavior. Not only do I no longer share the same beliefs of the common Mormon, but I grew tired of the strict dress code of white shirts on Sundays. I was also forbidden from partaking of such pleasures as nicotine, alcohol, drugs, tea, and coffee. In fact, their anti-caffeine stance is so strict, I wasn't even allowed to drink colas. I have consumed every item on that list, but the Mormon Church is no different from any other when it comes to imposing lifestyle restrictions. It is also no different than any other when being targeted for criticism about its belief system. A documentary was made in the 1980s that castigated the Mormon Church. It was made by evangelical Christians, and it was called The God Makers. It failed to acknowledge that all religions are God makers. I'm just doing my part to establish that the Mormon religion is no more a cult than any other. They're good people, like Elizabeth Smart's family. When I moved to Toronto from Moncton, New Brunswick, members of my church connected us to a church in Toronto, and they helped us move into our new home and get settled. Members of our church always helped us move. And when church members called upon us to help them in any way, we obliged. It was a community, and to some degree, a large family. Now, on to a man who represented his religion in the worst possible way. Spring 1969. 18-year-old Alice Elizabeth Keeler was a member of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints during her freshman year of Central Missouri State University in Warrensburg, Missouri. She lived in the town of Odessa, and she was such a sheltered young woman that even at the age of 18, her parents wouldn't let her go into town without a chaperone. Alice was accompanied by her pastor, who was driving her to the university so she could use the facility's library. She was so devout, she was writing her English term paper about the Book of Mormon, the church's scriptures. There was a house across the way that had been converted by RLDS students into a student union. When Alice paid a visit, she recognized two girls she knew who offered to introduce her around. Out of all the boys Alice met, the one who stood out by a long shot was named Jeffrey Lundgren. He was clad in the Mormon Sunday uniform, as Alice put it. He was dressed in a neatly pressed white short-sleeved shirt with tiny thin blue and yellow pinstripes. His shirt matched his blue corduroy slacks. He was also wearing brown penny loafers and no socks. Can you believe it? He wasn't wearing any socks. You would have to be a devout Mormon to fully appreciate how shocking the no socks element was. Alice only spoke to Jeffrey for a few minutes, but that's all it took for him to retain her attention long after they met. As Alice put it, Jeffrey was like no other man I had ever met. They didn't exchange numbers, and went their separate ways. Alice could not get Jeffrey out of her mind. In fact, when she found out a girl she knew there had gone on a date with Jeffrey, she grilled her on how it went. Her friend had nothing pleasant to report. She said, "He tried to get me drunk and take advantage of me." No socks? Alcohol? Premarital sex? What kind of Mormon was Jeffrey? Alice was disappointed. Jeffrey was certainly not the kind of Mormon boy next door she could bring home to meet her parents. One night at a church camp, Alice said a prayer asking God who she would end up marrying. One of the counselors had a prophecy for Alice after he called upon her to heed his prediction. He said, "Unto my sister Alice, thus saith the Spirit, I have seen your tears, and I have heard your prayers, and I will never leave you comfortless. I will direct your path, and I will hold your life in the palm of my hand, for there I have engraven you." Alice's interpretation of this missive was that she was not to worry about finding a husband. As she concluded, God was going to direct me to him. On the last day of camp, one of the Alpha Patriarch leaders spoke before the congregation in the dining hall. He singled Alice out for a special message. He said, "And unto you, my daughter Alice, thus saith the Lord, you shall have the answer to your prayers. You shall marry a companion whom I have prepared to bring forth my kingdom, and he shall be great in the eyes of these people, and shall do much good unto the children of men. For I have prepared him to bring forth a marvelous work and wonder." This was eerie, since Alice hadn't told anybody about the prayer. As she recalled, God had chosen me, lowly me, to help bring about his kingdom on earth. When Alice began the fall semester at Central Missouri State, she was reintroduced to Jeffrey through a mutual friend named Keith. Years later, Jeffrey would reminisce about the time he met Alice. "From the instant that I first saw her, I knew she was my wife." It wasn't true. They met before, and he didn't react that way to her when they were first introduced. Alice reminded him of this, albeit politely. "We met last spring. You weren't wearing any socks." He looked down at his feet, and it turned out he was still the no-sock-wearing rebel he was when Alice first laid eyes on him. Alice, Jeffrey, and Keith played cards, and later that night went out to an ice cream parlor. On the way, Keith informed Alice that Jeffrey wanted to ask her out, but was too shy to do so. Keith told her this in earshot of Jeffrey, who blushed. Keith explained that his parents were hosting a picnic on their farm. Jeffrey said to Alice, "Would you like to go?" She said, "How many other couples are going?" Keith said, 8 or 9. Alice said, "Okay, I'll go if there's a group." All the other couples except for Keith and his date failed to turn up. Alice and Jeffrey went and had a good time. They spent a great deal of the evening getting to know each other better, especially after Keith and his girlfriend went on a walk. In many ways, Alice and Jeffrey were different. Alice's family were poor. His were well off. She had low self-esteem. He was confident and charismatic. In fact, he was downright arrogant. Alice was born in the town of Independence, Missouri, on January 21st, 1951. Her parents continued to be fruitful and multiplied 3 more times after Alice's birth. The family moved to Independence because the reorganized Mormon church believed that Jesus would return to that location to build Zion on an Edenic portrait of peace and beauty. Her father was a welder, and her mother was a homemaker and full-time mother. Though her father did not earn a large salary, he and his wife always put their children's wants and needs first and indulged their every whim. This came to an end when her father was stricken with multiple sclerosis. Her mother was forced to work as a cook at a cafe, and Alice became a maternal figure to her siblings. Her siblings did not welcome Alice as a new authority in their lives and were frequently recalcitrant. With all the new responsibilities and static she received from her sisters, Alice would seek refuge at church. She became more devout than ever because it was there where she felt most welcome and appreciated. She didn't just attend services. She got involved in every activity and opportunity for fellowship that became available. Alice's sister Susan gave her evaluation of Alice's personality and psychological makeup, and it offers up a telling indication of how Alice would orient herself throughout the rest of this story. I'm not certain Alice knows sometimes the difference between the truth and lies. Alice has always been able to convince herself that whatever she wants to believe is the truth and nothing else matters. She was that way about religion and that way about her life. Alice never questioned anything she was told or heard about in church. The same could not be said about Jeffrey. As he told it, I would sit there on Sundays, and people would be in tears talking about the Lord's presence and His love and all these strange events that they claimed had happened to them. And I would think that something was wrong with me because I felt absolutely nothing and nothing had happened to me, like what they were describing. I was stone cold to all this emotional drivel. Jeffrey's primary motivation for going to church was to get out of the house. His family had long-standing roots in the RLDS, with relatives holding such lofty positions as pastor and elder. His parents were very status-conscious and easily embarrassed. They were seldom affectionate to him, and he never felt he measured up in their eyes. Jeffrey once explained to a psychologist how he felt about his father. No matter what I did, I never felt I was man enough for him. I always wanted and I love you, but what I got was male-on-male competition. We would play burnout. I'd throw a hard ball as hard as I could for him to catch, and he'd throw it back to me. I used to endure the pain when I was 7 or 8, just because I wanted to be with him. I can still remember one of the best moments in my life was when I was a freshman in high school, and I had become strong enough to hurt him when I threw the ball back. Despite Jeffrey's achievements in sports in high school, his classmates were less impressed by his showing as a human being. As one former classmate recalled, here was this guy who wanted to be liked and was shy and afraid to participate. Yet when he opened his mouth, he was a know-it-all. You felt sorry for him until you started talking to him, and then you realized that he was arrogant. No one really liked him. As an uncle remembered him, Jeff was never smiling. He never seemed very happy as a boy. The two couples drove back to the university. Jeffrey walked Alice up to the women's dormitory and asked her if he could kiss her goodnight. She said he could, and he did, and then he left. After a short time, the phone in the hallway of the dormitory rang. Alice's room was adjacent to the phone, so she answered. It was Jeffrey. He told her he wanted to thank her for spending time with him that day. He then asked her what time she was getting up in the morning. She said, giggling, "Why?" "Because I want to be waiting outside to carry your books." "Oh, Jeffrey, you don't have to do that. I plan to walk you to every one of your classes tomorrow." They talked for a few more minutes and then hung up. The next morning, Alice walked outdoors and found that Jeffrey had made good on his promise. There he was waiting for her. This would become a routine. Also routine for a week anyway. He sent her a long-stemmed rose daily. She became his world. It wasn't exactly a strategy from the pimp's playbook, but his old-fashioned courting was typical in their world. He would suggest what clothing she should wear when they talked at night. One day she forgot to wear the outfit he suggested, and he gave her the silent treatment. She asked, "What's wrong?" He said, "I'm just disappointed. I asked you to wear the blouse and skirt. I thought you agreed." He would watch her as she attended her chemistry class through a window. Stalky? To us, maybe, but Alice enjoyed the attention. In fact, she couldn't say enough good things about him. As she gushed to a classmate one day, "He's fascinating, he's handsome, he's athletic, he is everything that I have ever thought the perfect man should be. And he is crazy about me." A week after their first date, Jeffrey and Alice went on a hayride sponsored by the RLDS Student Union. At one point, Alice looked at Jeffrey. He was about to say something, but stopped himself. She said, "What you gonna do? Asked me to marry you?" He just stared at her. Finally, he said, "Yes, I want you to be my wife." She smirked at first, but soon realized he was serious. She said, "If you promise to fall in love with me, I will." "I already am in love with you, Alice." They were serious about getting married, but getting Jeffrey's parents' approval would come at a price. His parents were materialistic, elitist, and conforming. They would not look kindly upon Jeffrey marrying a girl who came from an indigent family. Jeffrey's mother criticized him because of the sound his sneakers made while he played basketball, telling him it humiliated her. How would she react to the news of this engagement? Jeffrey began to brainstorm ways to get his parents' consent. Meanwhile, feeling like his proposal was the surest strategy to spark Alice's interest in sex, he began to pressure her, seeing, as he did, that her legs were the gates to heaven despite St. Peter's objections. Though she had been advised against being sexually active out of wedlock, she figured it wouldn't matter since they were committed to marriage. Like my favorite flavor of Doritos, zesty cheese, it was impossible to have a taste without going back time and time again. As Alice described it, it was as if I had opened the floodgates. All Jeff ever wanted to do was have sex, sex, sex. It was so contrary to my upbringing that I felt very ashamed. I felt dirty. But to him it was a sign that I loved him. "If you love me, you'll do this," he said. And I wanted him to love me. Jeffrey took Alice home to introduce her to his parents over dinner. He warned her that they wouldn't like her because of the contrast in socioeconomic backgrounds. Jeffrey warned her that his father would make faces at her throughout the meal, so Alice kept her eyes glued to her plate. She wanted to compliment his mother on the decor of the house, but she was concerned that his mother would assume she was only pursuing Jeffrey because of his family's money. His parents were gracious hosts, much to Alice's relief, though later in the evening, when she went to a movie with Jeffrey, she had to excuse herself to go to the ladies' room and vomit from anxiety. Jeffrey was on academic probation because he was spending so much time with Alice that he neglected his studies and was frequently absent. Alice was concerned. He tried to allay her disquietude by telling her he was, quote, majoring in Alice. Alice wasn't really in a position to judge. Due to spending so much time with Jeffrey, she, too, was not performing as well academically as she had in the beginning of the semester. With the Christmas break approaching, Jeffrey was informed he had failed all his classes and was not welcome back for the winter semester. Due to this, he would be ineligible for the draft deferment. If he didn't get drafted, he would return to independence and live with his parents. Alice began to panic as losing Jeffrey had become a very real possibility. Unbeknownst to Alice, during the Christmas break, Jeffrey proposed to a childhood friend he hadn't even been dating named Sarah. He even told her about Alice and how if Sarah didn't marry him, Alice would be his auxiliary bride. Sarah was struck by how desperate he was to marry, seemingly on a mission to achieve validation as a human being. Meanwhile, she had become a more confident and outgoing person at university. Detailing the contrasts between her and Jeffrey at that point, she said, I remember thinking that I had gone away to college and had changed. I had overcome my insecurity. But I don't think Jeff had ever gotten to the point where he really believed in himself. I think he was looking for someone to love him and tell him that he was worth loving. Jeffrey fell back into his relationship with Alice. They came up with a plan to get their parents' approval for the marriage. They would force their hands by getting pregnant. Both parents got together with Jeffrey and Alice for a meeting on the subject. It did not go well. Jeffrey's father said that Jeffrey was about to tarnish the Lundgren name by conceiving a bastard. If you think that was harsh, his mother called Alice a whore. Alice, her parents, and Jeffrey left his parents' house quite sore about the whole thing. Jeffrey's parents reluctantly gave their blessing, but they insisted that he did not need to marry Alice just because she was pregnant. At one point, his mother tried to bribe him out of the marriage, as he said to Alice, she offered to pay me off if I would denounce you and walk away. They married in a small ceremony at an RLDS church on May 5th, 1970. The seats on Jerry's side of the aisle were empty except for one of his friends. He didn't want his parents to attend for fear that they would disrupt the proceedings. They had their honeymoon at a Six Flags amusement park. Alice's parents paid for the tuxedo and for the honeymoon. The first day at Six Flags, Alice was nauseous from morning sickness, so she demurred when he proposed a day of rides. He left her alone in the hotel room. He had never shown her such callous insensitivity before. There was more where that came from. When they returned to Odessa, the couple found themselves without money, employment, and lodgings. Alice's parents agreed to put them up until they could afford a place of their own. Alice's mother recalled that while Jeffrey was good about doing household chores, he was selfish with money. Her mother, Donna, was generous enough to lend Jeffrey her car, but when he returned it, the gas tank was usually empty. He was only concerned with his own needs and gratification. Needless to say, when he departed for his training in the Navy, the only member of the household who missed him was Alice. 3 weeks after Jeffrey left for the Navy, Alice gave birth to their son, Damon Paul Lundgren. She would call him there to inform him of the birth. She would often delegate the child care to her sisters and Donna, much to their chagrin. Jeffrey did not return home for Christmas. When Jeffrey visited on February 13th, 1971, he announced that he had 2 surprises for her. One was that he had been studying the scriptures so that they could at least reach parity in their research of the holy texts. The other surprise was that his father agreed to bless Damon, as his father was a high-ranking member of the church. Alice asked him if there were any other surprises. She had gotten him a Valentine's Day card. He did nothing of the sort. When she gave him the card, he blushed and said it hadn't occurred to him to buy one amid all the activity in which he was immersed. After Jeffrey's father blessed Damon, relations between his parents and Alice improved markedly. They even spoke to her. Soon after, Alice and Damon moved to California to join Jeffrey where he was stationed in the Navy. Though they could have saved money by living in military housing, Jeffrey and Alice insisted on living off base. He made $200 a month, and the rent was $110. It didn't stop Jeffrey from spending profligately. It applied even when it came to snacks. He remained true to the Mormon lifestyle restrictions, though he drank Pepsi by the liter and ate cookie dough constantly. Alice hated cooking and would eat out as much as possible. They would write home for cash. Aside from the kitchen, the bedroom was another space in their apartment where problems emerged. As Jeffrey explained it, she felt guilty because she had gotten pregnant before we were married. She started getting these migraine headaches. I was very frustrated, and I told her that she simply wasn't satisfying me. Alice laid the blame for this at Jeffrey's feet. Jeffrey was fixated on sex. Sex, sex, sex. That was all he thought about, all he wanted to do. He'd do it several times a day if I let him. And when we did it, he just wanted to satisfy himself. He didn't care about me and my feelings. Perhaps Alice was relieved when Jeffrey was deployed to Vietnam. He convinced his parents to let Alice and Damon live with them. Jeffrey spent all his free time studying the Book of Mormon. When the ship narrowly avoided being sunken by an attack by the North Vietnamese armed forces, Jeffrey attributed it to a prayer he had said as an appeal to God to protect him and the crew. As Jeffrey put it, God had showed me a sign. He had protected the ship because he didn't want me to die in Vietnam. Part of what led him to this conclusion was a verse from Scripture. For the Spirit is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He foresaw that he would do great things for the church. He saw himself as a saint and prophetic figure. Soon the young man who was once an insecure adolescent would struggle to squeeze his ego through the doorway. January 13th, 1973. Jeffrey's ship arrived at San Diego. Alice was happy to see him and didn't want him to be deployed again. As Jeffrey pointed out, I had an excellent time aboard that ship, and if it weren't for Alice, I would have made the Navy my career. I liked the lifestyle. But the first thing that Alice said when I stepped off the ship and met her was, "Promise me that you'll never leave me again." Those were her exact first words. She was so insecure. A friend of Jeffrey and Alice named Louise Stone disapproved of the way that he treated her. As Louise noted, "Sonny and I both thought that Jeffrey was tremendously rude to Alice. Jeff would make decisions without consulting her or even telling her about them. He had complete control in all decision-making, and he just expected Alice to accept that." As Alice said to Louise one night on the phone while Jeffrey was out of earshot, "I am not allowed to even touch the checkbook or to even know how much is in it." Indeed, while most couples manage their finances as a duo, Jeffrey was going solo. Jeffrey would flat out insult Alice, calling her things like stupid. He may not have treated her as his equal, to say the least, but Alice didn't put up much of a fight. As Alice said to Louise one day, Jeffrey says it's a man's job to love and obey and to serve his God. God is the man's master. That means the man must submit his will to God. The woman's job is to love and obey and serve her husband. He is her master. Louise wasn't nearly as receptive to this belief. As she put it, "I felt Jeffrey was in the process of making Alice into exactly what he wanted her to be. He wanted to control every part of her life, and she gave him that control in return for his love. She tried to be exactly what he wanted, the perfect little housewife. She cleaned, she cooked, she canned, she changed diapers, washed clothes, and took care of Jeffrey, and she did it without complaining because she had total faith that he would take care of her and he would love her." June 24th, 1974. Alice and Jeffrey's second child was born, a boy named Jason. It was about this time that Jeffrey got a friend converted into his faith, a man named Kevin Curry, who had been deployed on the same ship. November 4th, 1974. Jeffrey was discharged. He decided that he and his family would move back to Missouri. They moved in with Alice's parents. Jeffrey enrolled in classes at Central Missouri State University. This time he would not be majoring in Alice. He was more than capable at that point of deprioritizing her. The GI Bill paid his tuition and some basic living expenses. Did it cover Pepsi and cookie dough? No documentation has been uncovered. Though his academic history was abysmal, the dean agreed to give him a second chance to prove himself. He and his family moved to an apartment near the campus. By the time spring rolled around, Jeffrey had rehabilitated himself academically, earning straight A's. He made a good impression on his professors, one of whom offered him a position as a lab technician, which he readily accepted. Being knee-deep in academia made an impression on Jeffrey, inspiring him to become a professor. He also got heavily involved with the RLDS Student Union. He spent every available moment there, often participating in debates between liberal members and the Orthodox faction. Many of their arguments revolved around the role of women. The liberals felt that women should occupy leadership positions, while the conservatives felt that the leadership should remain as prescribed by the scriptures. He started hosting meetings for conservative RLDS students at his apartment. In late 1975, Jeffrey became a leadership candidate when he was considered for a priesthood position at his church. In early 1976, Jeffrey accepted a position teaching a basic electricity course at the university. This, despite being an undergraduate. He and Alice took out a loan to buy a house. Domestic bliss was within their reach, even with Jeffrey at the helm. It didn't last long. Louise and Sonny Stone moved to North Carolina when he was deployed once again. Alice called her on the phone one day, clearly distraught. She asked her if she could visit, and Louise welcomed her. Once there, Alice got the boys settled in bed and sat down with Louise. She said, weeping, "It's Jeffrey. He's lying to me, hiding things from me. My life is a total wreck." Jeffrey had certainly done all he could to make himself inaccessible. He removed the bell from the telephone. He got a post office box for mail. All mail except for spam was delivered to the P.O. box. Alice was baffled by all this at first, but then one day a creditor paid a visit to the house while Jeffrey was at school. Detailing the purpose of his visit to Louise, she said, "We are thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. He hasn't paid anything. I had to get away from it all. It's so embarrassing." Jeffrey must have forgotten about the Bible's stance on usury. Jesus did not look kindly upon the money lenders. Just then, Jeffrey pulled up in Louise's driveway in a brand new car. Alice ran outside to greet him. The same woman who was distraught by his reckless spending applauded his choice of a Monte Carlo as his new ride. Louise pulled Alice aside and said, "What about all the things that he hid from you? What about the bills? How'd he afford a new car?" Suddenly this failed to concern Alice. She shrugged and said, "He's here. That's all that matters." Jeffrey got financing from a credit union run by RLDS members, one of whom was his father. His father resigned out of embarrassment when his son was listed among names of delinquent borrowers. Years later, Jeffrey would blame Alice for their financial problems, saying, "Alice became just like my mother. Getting possessions, accumulating things became extremely important to her. My mistake was in not putting my foot down and just telling her no. But I had trouble doing that because Alice and I were having a difficult time in our personal relationship, and she wanted physical manifestations from me that showed that I loved her." Another complaint revolved around Alice's sexual output. As he remarked, Alice would say that if we made love once every 3 months, that was a compromise on her part. And I would tell her, "Alice, what you don't realize is that the 89 days that we didn't make love was a compromise on my part." Alice did not see eye to eye with Jeffrey on both financial and sexual matters. As she said to a psychologist, "The first 5 years of our marriage, I never had an orgasm. I didn't even know what one was until I read about them in a magazine. All he cared about was getting off. He didn't care about my feelings." Even more problems surfaced beyond their sex life and financial situation. As Jeffrey recalled, Alice was angry because she wasn't getting all the attention that she wanted. "I wasn't spending enough time with her," she'd say. She'd complain about how much I was studying and working. Those were more important than she was. I'd tell her, "Well, I have to support you in the family." But she wouldn't accept that. The truth was that she wanted to be the focal point of the world, and so she started demanding things. She'd say, "Oh, if we just could afford to move into our own house, I'd be happy." So I went down and got a loan from the Farmers Home Administration, and we bought a house, and she would be happy for a while, and then she would say, "Oh, Jeffrey, if you would just buy me." It never ended. She wanted me to prove that I loved her, over and over and over again. And then she started feeling the need to compete with my mother. My mother had told Alice that we would never have as much as they did, and this superiority complex of my parents, which was entirely my mother's doing, really got to Alice. When my mother got a 1.1 carat diamond ring for her wedding anniversary, Alice fussed until I bought her a 1.2 carat diamond ring. It had to be bigger than my mother's. As far as their reckless and frivolous spending went, their friends and relatives considered both to be responsible for their failure to live within their means. At one point, they were informed by the credit union that they would be evicted from the house if they didn't make a $300 payment. Jeffrey's mother wrote them a check for that amount. They spent some of the money at a restaurant and the rest on frivolities. They never made the house payment. One day, Jeffrey decided to resign from the job and his studies. As usual, Jeffrey blamed Alice. He said, "She told me that her father could get me a good-paying job in the ironworkers union. We needed the income, so I quit school and went to the union hall. But I only got one job before there was a strike, and I was out of work." Alice revealed the real reason Jeffrey left the university. Jeffrey got caught stealing money. He had collected some sort of student fee in the electrical lab, and instead of turning the money in, he spent it. Making matters worse for Jeffrey, he was informed that he would not be ordained a priest because a man who had known him well told one of the priests that he was not mature enough for the position. Jeffrey felt betrayed and opted to leave the sect. As he said to Alice at the time, "They are going to regret doing this to me." Jeffrey's grandfather used his connections to get Jeffrey a job as part of a construction crew on a large-scale farm. Jeffrey and his family moved into an unoccupied cottage at the site. He repaired equipment and supervised the livestock. His RLDS friends Dennis and Tanya Patrick got jobs at the farm through Jeffrey. The farm was also an orphanage, and Dennis and Tanya oversaw the orphans' care. Jeffrey would leave with his family a year later, stating that some of the orphaned boys were juvenile delinquents, and he was concerned about the influence they might have on his sons. Alice shed light on the truth of the situation. Jeffrey got caught stealing hay from the farm. He was selling it and keeping the cash. A week after they left the farm, Jeffrey was hired by Trans World Airlines to work as part of the pre-flight inspection crew. Alice was surprised by how long it took for Jeffrey to get a paycheck. Meanwhile, he was selling items from their house and working irregular hours. He said the schedule was due to the unpredictable conditions of individual airplanes. He said his first paycheck would arrive at the end of the month. Alice had never heard of a company making an employee work an entire month for their paycheck, even if that worker was new. 6 weeks in, she inquired about his compensation again. This time he told her someone in accounting made a mistake and gave this check to someone else, and that it would take several days to rectify the matter. When she asked him about where the grocery money was going to come from, he vowed to press his employer for his pay. When the check failed to materialize, she called his mother and asked her for money. His mother sent a $300 check. Alice was determined to find out the truth about the missing paychecks. She forced open a drawer on his desk. What she found in the top drawer was a stack of pornographic magazines and an angry letter from their landlord threatening to evict them. The following day, she called TWA to ask why Jeffrey's paychecks were held up. She was informed that nobody by his name was employed at the company. When she confronted him, he told her he was out looking for jobs. She found it hard to believe that he would go job hunting as late as midnight. A few days later, a police cruiser pulled up at their home. They had a warrant for Jeffrey's arrest. As Alice noted, he had written a check for some gun that he wanted to buy, and the check had bounced, but by then he had sold the gun for $300 and spent the money. Alice was pregnant. They had no telephone. They had no money. Jeffrey crashed the Monte Carlo weeks before, leaving it totaled. She couldn't bail him out. It was a hopeless situation. She collapsed on their living room floor and cried. As Alice tells it, I remember sitting in the corner, crying, and I kept saying to myself, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then Jeffrey came home, and he picked me up and held me, and he told me everything was going to be all right. I don't know how he got released, and I never found out how he had gotten home. All I knew was that he had come home. I said, Jeffrey, what's happening to us? And he said, don't worry, Alice. It is going to be okay. I will work it out. And I believed him. I believed he would take care of me. Alice's parents, Donna and Ralph, took them in. After a brief job search, Jeffrey was hired by a local hospital to repair medical equipment. The same day he got the job, their daughter Kristen was born. Alice and Jeffrey continued to have problems when it came to sex, especially in regard to frequency. One day they made arrangements to have sex. Alice sets this up. Just before Thanksgiving, Jeffrey took me out of the farm we had rented. He left the kids at my mom's, and he told me we were going out there to be alone and to make love. I went along with him because I wanted to make him happy. But I wasn't prepared for what happened. Jeffrey told Alice to go upstairs to the bathroom and run a bath for herself. Alice waited for Jeffrey in the bath water for a few minutes. Finally, he walked into the room naked. He told her to drain all the water out of the tub. Once the water was gone, he stepped into the tub and faced her. He bent over Alice and took a shit on her tits. This came as a shock to her, since she was unaware that he had a scat fetish. He was so self-involved, he was obsessed with his own excrement. As Alice recalled, he told me that he had been using it since he was 13. He would smear it on himself and masturbate with it. He proceeded to rub the shit all over her chest. Having finished with this, they had sex. They took a bath together afterwards, soaking in the shitty water. This took place at a farm they were renting for a year while the owners were away. Alice further reflected on how she felt about all this. It wasn't that I was cold and uncaring. I just didn't want to do all the things that he wanted me to do. I knew that my role as his wife was to satisfy him, and I wanted to do that and make him happy. But after we moved to the farm, he not only wanted to smear his feces on me, he got so he liked holding me down and putting it on my face. It was just too much. So I began telling him no, and that is what made him angry, and that is what caused all of the fights. Jeffrey would later deny that he had ever placed his feces on Alice. Then again, he was full of shit. Pun intended. Jeffrey had an affair, and Alice caught wind of it. She would eventually forgive him and blame herself. Jeffrey felt her undeserved shame was justified because he felt it was a wife's job to satisfy her husband and obey him. Alice increased her sexual output after they reconciled. Alice hadn't gotten a full glimpse of Jeffrey's kinky side. He had something else in store for her. He was curious about what sex is like from the woman's point of view. He wanted to know what it is like to have a penis thrusting in and out of her. Was he about to become a candidate for pegging? Not only was this shocking, but he brought some booze into the room. Those two naughty Mormons were now drinking alcohol. Appalling. Alice tells the rest of the story. I was getting pretty drunk, and he told me that he wanted to do something different. He told me that he wanted me to give him a bath and wash his hair, which I did, and then he had me comb it and set it in rollers. He had me clean and file his fingernails and toenails and then polish them. Then he asked me for one of my nightgowns, and he put it on. He asked me to shave his legs, and I did. And he put on a pair of my pantyhose, and I was pretty drunk by this time. And he decided to model for me. So I put makeup, women's makeup, on his face and took out the hair rollers. All this time, he was telling me to drink this vodka and Coke. And I was getting really drunk. I was sloppy drunk. And then he pulled this package out from under the bed. And he said that he wanted to show it to me. And he opened it up and took out a dildo and a leather harness. And I thought, my God, what is he going to do to me? But he told me that the harness was for me to wear. He wanted me to put on the dildo, and he wanted me to have sex with him. He wanted me to have anal intercourse with him, and it was supposed to be a rape. I said, no. I said, Jeffrey, this is too weird. I may be drunk, but I'm not going to do that. He said, oh, yes, you are. And we started arguing, and that is when I decided just to get out of the bedroom. So I went into the hallway, and he came after me, and he said, you are going to do what I tell you to do. And I said, oh, no, I'm not. And he said, well, then, I'll get someone who will. I was drunk and furious, and I yelled at him. I said, oh, you going to get your hospital whore? And he said, yeah, she'll do it for me. I yelled, you son of a bitch, and I went for his throat. I dug my fingernails into his neck. I wanted to hurt him so bad. Hurt him like he had hurt me. I was so angry. I had tried and tried and tried to get him to tell me that he was sorry about having an affair, but he always refused. He always said, I'm not going to grovel in the dirt for you, Alice. It's your fault that it happened. I was so furious about everything. The lies, the affair, everything. So I grabbed him around the throat and tried to hurt him. And he grabbed me and pulled me off. And when he did, he threw me against the wall. And my back hit the doorknob, right in the middle of the back. And I remember just going limp with the pain and sliding down the wall. I remember the pain was excruciating. I crawled into the bathroom, and I locked the door, and I passed out. He was trying to take the hinges off, and was yelling at me to unlock the door. But I wouldn't, and I passed out. Jeffrey's far-fetched version of this story goes as follows. One night I went downstairs to get something to eat, and when I came back upstairs, she was waiting for me at the door of our bedroom with a baseball bat. She was enraged about the affair, almost catatonic, and she went on an angry tirade. She swung at me with the baseball bat and missed. I caught her with my arms and picked her up. I didn't have any feelings of anger. She claims that I threw her against the doorknob, but that isn't true. She didn't hit anything when I tossed her back. A few days later, she slipped while she was walking down the stairs and fell and hit her back. That's how she got hurt. Alice's spleen was ruptured due to their confrontation, and it led to internal bleeding. There were no serious complications at first, but one day while she was visiting Jeffrey at the hospital, she passed out and dropped to the floor. Jeffrey carried her to the ER, where doctors went to work on her immediately. Her spleen had not stopped bleeding for the preceding 2 weeks, and it was removed. She came close to dying. For weeks, Alice suffered endless pain due to the aftermath of the surgery, and she was frequently sedated with painkillers. Jeffrey would have sex with, or shall I say, rape her while she was passed out or semi-conscious. She soon found herself pregnant. She was concerned the painkillers would harm the fetus. Jeffrey was fucking other people over before they got wise to his MO. He was writing bad checks again. Donna and Ralph wound up paying off these debts to the local merchants, who they had come to know very well. They were living in a town with less than 100 residents, so it was becoming quite an embarrassment. They were also about to be as broke as Jeffrey and Alice after paying off the debts. Donna warned him that the local prosecutor was more than willing to charge someone for writing bad checks. Jeffrey agreed to stop, but then wrote a check to his landlord the following day that bounced. He had only paid 2 months' rent, which included the month they moved in. They wound up moving out and in with Donna and Ralph once again. The owners of the house they were staying in returned, though they were initially reluctant to turf them out. The sympathy they felt expired as soon as they entered the house. For one thing, Jeffrey was told that many of the owners' personal belongings were kept in the padlocked garage, which was to remain locked. Jeffrey broke into the garage and took several items. Mr. Wilcox described the interior of the house after they left. The place was a wreck. It looked like a tornado had sucked up everything and thrown it around. He detected a foul odor emanating from the basement. He nearly threw up into his mouth when he discovered that Jeffrey sawed through the pipe that drained the toilet. As Wilcox recalled, there was toilet paper, feces, urine, everything dropped directly down onto the basement floor, just like in an outhouse. There was a pile of human waste at least 1 foot deep and 6 feet in diameter. There was other damage, holes in the walls, stains and filth on carpets. On the floor of the master bedroom's closet was a stack of pornographic magazines whose content featured BDSM activity. There was something else of note on the closet floor. As Wilcox told it, it was a plastic dildo that was still caked with feces. I mean, it was caked with it. They hadn't washed it. They just tossed it in there. In another room, Jeffrey kept all his religious texts and RLDS paraphernalia. It was quite a juxtaposition, but it did represent the two extremes of Jeffrey Lundgren. Wilcox had nothing good to say about Jeffrey at that point. He described him thusly: he just wasn't operating from the same perspective that most people operate from. I have never met a person who wanted to be liked more than Jeffrey. He wanted to be liked, he wanted to be admired, yet he didn't want to do anything to earn you liking him. At the same time, I also never knew anyone who thought so much of himself. It wasn't arrogance, it was intense self-importance. He simply looked upon himself as someone who was unique, special, and he felt people needed to treat him special. Jeffrey got fired from his hospital job when he got caught fondling his mistress's breasts in an office. Naturally, this was not the story he gave Alice, who was 6 months pregnant. He told her he could make more money in independence and that nobody appreciated him at the hospital. He moved to Independence and lived with his brother. He told Alice he would get a job and send her money. He sent her $5 over a span of 4 months. Jeffrey showed up at the hospital when Alice gave birth to their 4th child, a boy. Alice told the story best. I was so terrified that the drugs I had taken after my spleen was removed had harmed my baby, but the doctor said, "Alice, he's got all of his fingers and toes." And I was so happy that I started crying. You see, I had wondered why God had spared my life when my spleen ruptured. I should have died. My life was so miserable, but He spared me so that I could give birth. I looked over at Jeffrey because I wanted to tell him and share it with him, and I reached for his hand, and he knocked it away. He was crying, and I said, "What's wrong?" "The baby's okay. He's okay." And Jeffrey glared at me, and he said, "He!" And I said, "Yes, honey, it's a boy." And Jeffrey said, "Alice, I wanted a girl. Can't you do anything right?" And he turned around and he walked out. He left me there with my son and just walked out. It got worse. She found out that Jeffrey removed her and the children from his staff medical insurance and pocketed the money for himself. They owed the hospital thousands of dollars for the splenectomy and the birth, and they would not perform one more procedure until they were paid in full. As Alice intimated to Donna when she went to visit her at the hospital, "Mama, I married Jeffrey for better or worse, but it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse." Jeffrey continued to search for work and independence. On the weekends, he would visit Alice at her parents' place. They owned a sunken bathtub, and Alice continued to indulge his penchant for shitting on her tits and pissing in her face. When her parents went away for a weekend on one occasion, he was impatient to get the kids to bed so he could engage Alice in some sex play. As she detailed it, "Jeffrey told me to strip, and I did. And they told me to lie down on the bed. He had bought some rope, and he had already cut it into 4 pieces that he used to tie me onto the bed. He told me that he wanted to see what it was like, bondage. I went along with it because it didn't seem like such a big thing. They had sex, and she expected him to untie her. When she asked him to do so, he refused. To quote Alice, I began to panic, and I said, 'Jeffrey, untie me.' And he said, 'Then it wouldn't be any fun.' She said that throughout the night, he fornicated with her numerous times. He tied her into several positions. In the morning, she asked him to untie her so she could use the bathroom. He removed the rope from her legs, but not her hands. He took her to the bathroom and climbed into the bathtub. Alice recalled, "He ordered me to urinate on him, and I did. Then we went back into the bedroom, and he tied me back up. He kept her bound to their bed all day Saturday and most of Sunday, releasing her only when her parents were due to return. He told their kids she was sick and didn't want to infect them. Alice managed to see a silver lining in the situation. I wanted to please him. I wanted to make him happy. I kept thinking, well, at least we are spending time together. At least he is not with some other woman." Jeffrey was arrested for passing yet another bad check. Alice's aunt wrote a $300 check for bail that was made out to Ralph. Alice's concern was that if it were made out to Jeffrey, the bank would use the funds to pay off other bad checks. Alice reflected on the disaster Jeffrey had made of their lives at the time as she said a prayer. I reached the bottom, the absolute bottom. I had been married to this man for 11 years, and we had nothing to show for it. Absolutely nothing. I had always dreamed about having a house with a white picket fence and a nice family, but now I was thrilled just to have enough money to buy milk for the children. What had gone wrong? I remember Charles had fallen asleep in the front seat while I was driving, and it was raining, and I just started talking to God. What am I supposed to do? I said. I'm married to this man for life. He lies to me. He can't keep a job. He cheats on me. Why, God, are you doing this to me? I began to think that maybe God had a purpose for doing this, but I just didn't see it. After being released from jail, Jeffrey was hired to work for a hospital as a biomedical technician. He was to earn a salary of $32,000 a year, $122,000 when adjusted for inflation. Donna pressured him to use his compensation to pay off the bad checks he had written, and he complied. Now that their finances had improved, they moved into a house and began attending church services again. Jeffrey became determined to be called to the priesthood, and that time around, he decided it was something that had to be earned. He volunteered to do any kind of work the church needed to be done. His family attended church services and Sunday school. Eventually, the elders decided he was worth recommending for the priesthood. Meanwhile, Jeffrey's conduct at work wasn't nearly as exemplary. He was issued a company car to commute to a satellite hospital. It was not to be used for personal reasons, especially not on his days off. However, he had been caught using the car for personal reasons. He lied when confronted about it by his boss. His boss hated liars. Jeffrey was warned that if he was found to be using the car for personal reasons again, he would be fired. 2 days later, Jeffrey was caught using the car for personal reasons, and he was terminated, as promised. It was 3 weeks before Christmas, and Jeffrey and Alice had no money to buy presents for their children. Tanya took Alice shopping and bought $400 worth of merchandise with her own credit card. Tanya's husband, Dennis, recalled how Jeffrey was constantly appealing to him for money. I didn't mind helping at first, but Jeffrey started stopping by all the time, and he'd be broke, and he'd need gas money, and he'd just sort of sit there until I gave him $10 or $20. It was like he just expected it. Jeffrey was soon hired to work as a salesman, but despite being warned by his previous boss not to trust him with charge accounts and a company car, his supervisor at his new job did both. Jeffrey used the credit cards and company car for his own personal interests and was terminated. It was his last spate of legitimate employment. Around this time, 1982, some Mormon families were assembling into a commune. It had occurred in the 1800s during the early days of the Mormon religion. One practicing Mormon who decided to live in a burgeoning commune was Dr. Jim Robbins. As he put it, I was interested in a sharing all things in common living arrangement because I felt that God wants every man, woman, and child to live for one another, not simply to accumulate as much as they can for themselves. He and his family had to back out when he was diagnosed with skin cancer, but two other families congregated to form the commune. Jim and his wife Laura got to know Jeffrey and Alice during a weekend church retreat for married couples, and the foursome became friends. They frequently visited each other's homes on a social basis. Jim and Laura were so taken with the couple that when they learned they were struggling due to Jeffrey's unemployment, they decided to support them with a $200 weekly stipend. Eventually, Jim proposed that they combine their two families. Jeffrey and Alice were eager to do so. Jim reflected on this decision later. As soon as I brought up this subject, I knew in my heart that I was making a mistake. In looking back on it, my only explanation is that I think I felt guilty. You see, we had originally planned to join with these two other couples before I was diagnosed as having cancer. They had gone ahead and had disbanded after about a year. I think asking the Lundgrens to form an all things in common relationship was sort of like marrying on the rebound after a divorce. Jim added a caveat to the proposal. He and Laura would only get involved as long as it didn't include going into debt. It wasn't just the Robins who were helping the Lundgrens. Other church members were donating money and other items to keep them going. This doesn't surprise me, as it has been a long-standing tradition in the church to help members who have fallen on hard times. They likely didn't suspect at the time that they were being used. When Louise and Sonny Stone moved to Independence, they had been informed beforehand that the Lundgrens were flat broke without even enough money to buy food. When Louise paid a visit to their house, she was surprised to find several bags of groceries on the front porch. Alice said, "Help me carry these inside." "Alice, where did all this come from? Who left it here?" "Oh, I don't know. Jeffrey told me that he was going to pray about getting us enough to eat, and he prayed last night about it." "What?" "Louise, I don't question God, and neither should you." As Louise reflected, I told Alice that it wasn't right for her and Jeffrey to live off other people. I asked her why Jeffrey didn't go get a job like everyone else. She told me that Jeff had things to do for God, and therefore he wasn't required to work like everyone else. Other people were supposed to take care of him. That was their job. His was to serve God. Their plans to build the commune went bust when the Lundgrens were unable to contribute funds for the project, while the Robinsons would have had to invest money they really didn't have. Another important matter relating to finances emerged. Supporting the Lundgrens was something the Robinsons just could not afford anymore. When Jeffrey found out they weren't going to give him and Alice any money, he was outraged. He went to their house to confront Jim. He opened with, "Your wife told my wife that you don't want to continue your relationship with us?" "What are you talking about, Jeffrey?" "Your wife informed my wife that you can't help us any longer financially." "That's right, Jeff. We just can't afford it. It's too much of a burden right now." "What kind of an excuse is that? I expect you to keep your commitments to me." This pissed Jim off. It pissed him off royal. "Jeff, you are the most ungrateful person I've ever known. How can you stand there and carry on like this because now I'm telling you we can't afford it anymore? You act like we owe you this money." Jeffrey turned around and walked away in a snit, saying nothing. That Sunday at church, the Lundgrens and the Robinsons kept their distance from one another. October 1983. Jeffrey Lundgren was ordained into the priesthood. He had not been employed for a year, but it wasn't counted against him. He was now permitted to preach, not every Sunday, but it became a semi-regular occurrence. He mostly read scriptures and focused on the topic of God's wrath. His preaching style was more typical of the fire and brimstone variety you would encounter in a Baptist church. Jim wasn't surprised, as he recalled. During our scriptural studies, Jeffrey always focused on scriptures that would enable him to mentally put people he didn't like into the lake of fire and brimstone. He would say, "See this scripture? Why, God could be talking about so-and-so. He could be calling that person a son of perdition, evil." And I'd say, "Why, Jeff, you don't know what you are talking about. That person is not a son of perdition. It's like you are finding pleasure in condemning people. The Lord wants to save lives, not destroy them by casting them into the pit." But he always argued with me. "So-and-so fits all the criteria of that scripture," he'd say. "They should be destroyed." Jeffrey's oratory technique was not well received by the congregation, and an elder was directed to speak with him about taking a different approach. They said to him, "Our God is a God of love, not damnation." Jeffrey argued that it was not against church policy to read scriptures during a talk. He was not permitted to give a testimony again. On Halloween that year, 13-year-old Damon Lundgren was running across a parking lot following a youth group meeting when he tripped and fell. When an adult member of the church discovered him on the ground, Damon was writhing from pain while holding his chest. The church youth group sponsor drove him home. When the church youth group sponsor arrived at the Lundgren's home, he approached Jeffrey and told him what happened. He said, "I think you should get Damon to the hospital." Jeffrey said, "We don't have any insurance. He'll be okay." Jeffrey yelled at Damon to get out of the house. Jeffrey yelled at Damon to get out of the car. The youth group sponsor intervened. He said, "The church will pay for it. This kid is in pain." "Well, I can't take him because I'm here alone with the other kids." The youth group sponsor offered to stay with the other kids so Jeffrey could take Damon to the emergency room of the hospital across the street. Jeffrey resisted. "I don't like leaving my children with strangers." Frustrated, the youth group leader took Damon to the hospital himself. Jeffrey accompanied them to sign paperwork. He returned home shortly afterward to call Alice. She was with Tanya. She asked Dennis if he would go to the hospital with her to say a prayer for Damon. Dennis anointed Damon's head with oil and said a prayer. A doctor informed Alice that one of Damon's ribs was broken and that it had punctured his liver. He was bleeding internally, necessitating surgery. Alice spent 5 days at the hospital so she could be at Damon's side. She had experienced what it is like to be alone after surgery, so she could sympathize. On the 5th day, Jeffrey convinced her to come home for dinner. They had a romantic candlelit dinner together. Once she finished her dessert, she decided to visit Damon. Jeffrey flew into a rage. He slammed her up against the dining room wall. Shouting, he said, "By God, woman, you belong in this house, and this is where you are going to stay. Now get in the bedroom." Mockingly, Alice said, "What's wrong, Jeff?" Are you feeling neglected because you had to go 5 whole days without any sex? Is that what it was? That he had to waste nearly a week's worth of feces on a toilet? He threw her down to the floor. As Alice recalled, he tore open my blouse and he raped me. He raped me on the floor, and when he got done, he got up and took my bathrobe and threw it at me. I went into the bathroom and I sat on the floor and cried, and then I got into the tub, and after about a half hour, he came in with a red rose that he had put into a vase, and he put it next to me, and he sat down next to the tub, and he stroked my face, and he told me that he loved me and that he was glad that we were married. It was like we were two normal persons, like nothing had happened. When asked about this incident years later, Jeffrey said it is impossible for a husband to rape his wife because her purpose as a living being is to please him sexually. Alice told Louise Stone about the rape. Louise advised her to get a divorce. She told her she would help her get an attorney. A few days later, Jeffrey told Alice about a vision he experienced. He became emotional and cried throughout his retelling. It went as follows. I had gone out onto the front porch of our house because I could see the emergency room from there. And I was trying to see what was happening with Damon across the street. I began to pray, but I didn't know what words to use. Suddenly words started coming into my mind, and I began to pray for the son, but it wasn't Damon that these words were about. It was the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and just as I started to say them, the hospital dissolved away, and I was no longer in Independence. I was at Calvary, and I was facing the cross. I was standing to the right of it. This was not like a movie. I was actually there. I was physically, totally, completely there, and I looked up at Christ, and he was in total agony, and I realized that there were plenty of people who could pray for my son, but no one had prayed for the Son, Jesus Christ. All of the disciples had been upset about losing him, but no one had prayed for him, and I heard him call out with a loud voice. He was calling for Elias, and it was horrible. I could hear him struggle and see his breath. He would struggle to raise himself up to get a gasp of air, and then his entire body would sag. And I wanted to take him down, and he looked at me, and I could tell that he wanted me to take him down. But I couldn't take him down because I needed him to die, just as every other creature needed him to die. We all helped crucify him because we needed him to die for our sins. So I didn't help him. I rejected him. I had to say, crucify him, just like everyone else, because I needed that atonement. It was like I had put a nail in his hand. I looked at him, and I knew, and he knew that I was rejecting him. You see, I understand rejection. I understand what it is like to be rejected, and he knew too. So I just walked up to the base of the cross, and I began to weep. And I don't know how to explain this, but all of a sudden, all I can say is, I was looking out of Christ's eyes. I saw everything, and I was aware that I was in his head and in his consciousness. And I could see all things, all eternity, from the beginning of time to the present into the future. It was like a giant panorama. And then I felt like his pure and total love, and I understood that there was no anger in him at all. Then I saw my own life, and I realized that love was a foreign object to me, that I didn't understand love, especially love like Christ's. And then it was over. The scene dissolved back, and I found myself staring at the hospital. I began to weep, and the next thing that I knew, Dennis Patrick was walking up the steps to see if I was okay. He thought I was crying about Damon, but I was crying because I had been with Christ and felt his love and then been brought back to reality. Alice told him it was the most beautiful religious experience she had ever heard about. She said, "But what does it mean?" He said, "I'm not sure yet, but God is preparing me for something. He is directing both of our lives." Later the same day, Louise called Alice to find out if she was serious about her plans to divorce Jeffrey. Alice said, "I can't leave Jeffrey. He told me about a vision that he had. He told me that he has work to do for God. He told me that if I left him, he wouldn't be able to do what God wanted." "What are you talking about, Alice?" "Louise, haven't you been listening to me? God told Jeff that he is preparing him for an important mission in the church. I can't leave him now. It's impossible." Jeffrey lost another teaching position at the church because of his fire and brimstone dynamic. It was also because he was active in the resistance to social reforms in the church, spearheaded by the liberals. He did not want women to be priests, and he made sure to be quite vocal about it. He also stirred up controversy when he promoted the idea that God and Jesus were the same being. After losing that position, he began teaching scripture classes in his home to 6 couples, primarily close friends. Jeffrey had another vision. He said he was given a choice between earthly riches or the divinity of a man who communes with God and devotes himself to his word. Whether he was lying or not, he came across like a man possessed. He said, "When I had that vision, I became convinced that I would walk on an actual path someday, like the one that I had seen, and would actually be given or shown some sort of mysterious records. I was going to be instrumental in bringing them forth. I did not see myself as a prophet at that point, but after I had that vision, I began studying what kind of man I needed to become to be acceptable to God so that I could do what He wanted. My entire attention was focused on the prophets and how I could be like one of them." One day Jeffrey was mowing the lawn and thinking about God while doing so. He was trying to figure out what his ultimate mission was. As he recalled, I began asking God questions in my mind. I was trying to figure all of this out, and I asked, "What would you have me do?" And God put a thought in my mind. "The answer is already written," he said. He ran in the house and grabbed his copy of the Doctrine and Covenants. It's a book of revelations written by Mormon church founder and con man Joseph Smith Jr. After landing on section 38, he shouted, "I got it! I know what I am supposed to do." It was in section 38 where God allegedly ordered Joseph Smith to leave New York State and migrate to Kirtland, Ohio, to join a man named Sidney Rigdon, who was also heavily involved with the church. There was a Mormon temple in Kirtland, and Jeffrey felt drawn to it, especially after having once paid a visit. He announced to his wife and family that they were moving to Kirtland. He said, "We must go to the Kirtland temple because that is where the scriptures are telling me to go if I want to be endowed with the power." Alice was all for it, except she had no idea how they were going to finance the move. Soon she discovered in a church newsletter that the RLDS was in the market for volunteers to run the temple. It was not a salaried position, so the volunteers would have to be self-sustaining financially. However, the church would provide a house and pay the utilities. When Jeffrey was asked about how he would support the family, he lied and said his parents agreed to bequeath his inheritance to him then. He was a pro when it came to lying about money, so it was a breeze for him to pull that off. He got the job. The Lundgrens raised $1,500 for the move by borrowing money from churchgoers, receiving donations from others, and selling some of their possessions. Reflecting on whether it was the right decision, Jeffrey said, "Everyone considered me a failure. My father, my mother, even Alice, because I had not accumulated a bunch of possessions or stayed at one job. But it suddenly dawned on me why. God had been trying to get my attention. He didn't want me to succeed at all those other jobs. He wanted me to fail so that I would eventually come to Him and do what He wanted me to do. In fact, I believe that He caused me to fail. I had been created for one purpose, and it wasn't working in a hospital. I loved the scriptures, and everyone told me that I knew them better than anyone. Why? Because it was all part of His plan." Jeffrey was convinced that he would not fail at his new undertaking. As he put it, "The Lord had chosen me, for a great mission. He hadn't chosen them. He hadn't given my father this vision. He hadn't given it to Wallace B. Smith. He had chosen me. I truly believed that, and I saw this as a new adventure, a new start. We were going down God's path, and I wasn't going to let Him down. I was going to do whatever God commanded." Did God tell you to shit on your wife? Just curious. August 19th, 1984. The Lundgrens arrived in Kirtland. The house they were given was a dump. Jeffrey couldn't wait to get started with his work. The couple that welcomed them, the Lords, Eleanor and Bill, were impressed with the couple. Bill had so much faith in Jeffrey that he elected to put him in charge of managing the temple's finances. It brought in $20,000 a year in souvenir sales. If only he had been forewarned. While giving a tour of the temple for his friends, Cheryl and Dennis Avery, both Orthodox RLDS Mormons, he pointed out a symbol on a pulpit that had been used by priests for generations. Explaining what it meant, he said, "This is the symbol of man. Every book about symbols says that this design means man. I have searched and searched, and there is no symbol on any of the pulpits for woman. None. God never intended for women to be ordained as priests. Otherwise, He would have put the symbol for woman on a pulpit." Jeffrey also told Dennis a long-winded story about one of his visions, since it was reminiscent of the vision stories you heard earlier. But he said to Dennis, "I'm not certain, but clearly the RLDS is without a prophet, and God is going to bring forth a new one to preach the truth." Gee, I wonder who Jeffrey had in mind. Soon Alice was having visions of her own. There was no sign that she was going to divorce Jeffrey, not with descriptions of dreams like this. You were standing in the temple, and a tall, thin man was on your right, and a shorter, more muscular man was on your left. I was sitting in the temple in the back row, and when I looked up, there was this beam of pure white light coming down on the three of you, and it was so white and so intense. That's all I could see was the outline of you three, and then a pure white personage appeared and talked to you and exchanged something with the three of you. I couldn't quite make out who it was until I saw his hands. His hands had nail prints in them. To further drive home the point, she said to Jeffrey, "It was Jesus, Jeffrey. Jesus appeared to you. Oh, Jeffrey, this is just like the patriarch said it would be. God wants you to bring forth a great message. He wants you to prepare the way for Christ's return." Though Jeffrey had a lot of people convinced at the time that he was a genuine holy man, the shroud would drop years later and expose him for what he really was. To quote Alice in conversation with their friend Kevin, Jeffrey reminds me a lot of the agent in that movie. He figures out a person's mindset, what they want, how they think, what their weaknesses are, and then he uses that to get whatever he wants from them. Jeffrey and Alice's marriage was still stable, though they still argued about sex. To quote Alice, "The feces wasn't so common. Mostly, he would just bend my body in all sorts of uncomfortable positions. He was really getting into dominance and wanting to control me, in the bed and everywhere else. But I still loved him, and I truly believed that Jeff could be someone important in the church." Jeffrey claimed to Alice that he encountered an angel while searching for plates bearing messages from God, and as usual, she believed him. They were ground zero for a cult. They were being financially supported by friends, so Jeffrey felt he could go forth with his mission as a self-appointed prophet. As Alice's head was spinning while contemplating all this, Jeffrey said to her, "Take off your clothes. We are going to have anal sex." Alice's mouth was agape, but then she removed her clothing upon his command. Reflecting on that time in her life, Alice said, "I had reached a point where I had to choose. Was I going to believe what Jeffrey was telling me and support him, or was I going to doubt and question him? I decided that he truly was my Lord and my Master." After being disciplined by a senior church official by refusing a request to make Jeffrey an elder, the move only made Lundgren more popular among the priesthood and congregation. After all, the leader who refused to make him an elder was a progressive member of the church, and Jeffrey represented the conservatives. As Alice recalled, Jeffrey became almost a folk hero in the eyes of many fundamentalists in the church, and he was gaining a tremendous following. All day, every day, we had people coming to our front door asking to see Jeffrey. Even Mormons, LDS, invited him to speak to them about the temple. People would come and ask if they could have their picture taken with Jeffrey because of his growing reputation. Jeffrey latched on to the theory of chiasmus. Chiasmus are works of ancient Hebrew poetry, and the way they are structured is that they contain stanzas that are written in reverse order. Though there is no evidence that scriptures in the English translations of the Holy Bible and the Mormon texts were written as chiasmus, Jeffrey Lundgren was convinced of it, so much so that when nobody around him or within the entire RLDS establishment came to that deduction before he did, he was convinced that it was a sign from God that he was to be the new prophet. As he said to Alice, "I had no recollection of my previous lives because my eyes were sealed by God. But now it is my time. I am the last seer. My eyes are being unsealed so that I can bring the pattern into the world and redeem Zion." Afterward, he visited the temple and prayed. He claimed that Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, appeared to him as an apparition. To quote Jeffrey, "The angel was Joseph Smith. He didn't speak, but I looked at him and he smiled. He smiled a big smile, and all the fear that I had in my heart was pulled, and I felt the greatest joy and peace that I had ever felt. I sensed the purity of Christ's love, and I understood why he was smiling. He looked at me, and in a very simple sense, there was a change of command taking place. He had waited for me a long time, and now his job was finished. I was finally at the point where it could happen, where he could turn the role of the prophet over to me so that the scriptures could be fulfilled." Jeffrey and Alice's friend Eleanor Lord noted the change that came over Jeffrey, one upon which she did not look favorably. Jeffrey became more and more arrogant. He would never come out and say to me, "I am a prophet of God." But I knew that was what he thought. At first, I wanted to take him aside and say, "Come on, Jeffrey, get real." But then I thought, who am I to say whom the Lord might raise up to be a prophet? Jeffrey's friend Kevin Curry said, Jeffrey was basically developing his own language. He would diagram a verse, and then he would say that the words that he had placed opposite each other were synonymous. Oftentimes, they clearly weren't. Sometimes they were antonyms, but he didn't care. He would say, well, these words might appear opposite to you, but in God's eyes, they are exactly the same. I just didn't see any point in it, because he had basically come up with a way for him to say anything that he wanted to say, interpret Scripture any way that he wanted to interpret it. And if you disagreed with him, he told you that you were wrong and didn't understand the pattern because you weren't the seer. Dennis Patrick informed Jeffrey in a letter that he was quitting his job and moving to Kirtland. The reason was that he had heard a voice speaking to him that urged him to do so. He felt that it was prophecy. When he told Jeffrey about it, Lundgren was furious, as he said to Alice, "Who does Dennis think he is? There is only one person God speaks to, and that is his prophet. And I am that man, not Dennis Patrick. God told me this would happen." He wrote this in response to Dennis's letter. "You are not welcome here. You are not coming to Ohio for the right reasons." This was enough to stop Dennis in his tracks. He canceled the sale of his house. The job from which he had resigned had already been filled. Jeffrey didn't care that Dennis upset his apple cart to such a degree. He scolded him by saying, "I'm not inviting you up here until you are ready to learn the truth." Like a typical cult leader, Jeffrey Lundgren required unfettered obedience from the followers. The Averys, Cheryl and Dennis, moved to Kirtland, much to Jeffrey and Alice's dismay. Though they were nice to their faces, when they were not around, they mocked, criticized, and outright insulted them. Cheryl's ineptitude in the kitchen was one subject that stimulated those discussions. One day, the Lundgren's friend Richard Brand said, "Why are the Averys here?" Jeffrey said, "So I can have their money." He was serious. Jeffrey still had contempt for Dennis and Tanya Patrick. They were invited to move to Kirtland, but they did not receive a warm welcome from Jeffrey Lundgren. Far from it. When Dennis, Tanya, and their 6-year-old daughter Molly knocked on the door, Jeffrey answered and greeted them with a cold look in his eye. To quote Tanya, "Jeff and Alice didn't want to have anything to do with us. Jeffrey had ordered Alice not to even talk to me." Dennis said, "What's going on, Jeff?" Jeffrey said, "There are things you have to learn. Until you do, you are not part of the family. Christ may have loved them unconditionally, but not Jeffrey Lundgren." Jeffrey was now teaching a scripture class, and he made it clear to his students that they had to erase everything they had learned from the mainstream Christian, LDS, and RLDS orthodoxy, and accept the gospel according to Jeffrey Lundgren. He realized he needed to conceal the more egomaniacal elements of his revelation. So he said to them, "This is not my rule. It is what God is commanding you to do." He backed it up with a verse from section 90 in the Doctrine and Covenants. "The wicked one cometh and taketh away light and truth, through disobedience from the children of men, and because of the tradition of their fathers. But I have commanded you to bring up your children in light and truth." Using chiasmus to construct a diagram of these verses, he read it to them. A. The wicked one cometh and taketh away light and truth. B. Through disobedience from the children of men. C. And because of the tradition of their fathers. B. Because I have commanded you to bring up your children. A. In light and truth. He pointed out that because all the lines contained similar words, mirroring each other, that it provided proof of a presence of chiasmus. To further reinforce the importance of ceding to his authority on the scriptures, he said, "You must get Satan's garbage out of your memory banks. I will teach you what to think, what to believe." His message had now crossed the line from dogma to propaganda. Though you would likely find it difficult to believe what Lundgren was preaching, Dennis Patrick's experience was very different. To quote Dennis, "It was very calculated and extremely effective. Jeffrey never said anything without having scriptures to back it up, and he would explain each verse and build on each verse, piece by piece, until he had constructed an elaborate foundation and proven his point. It was difficult to challenge him because he got through. It didn't seem like he was telling you to do something. It seemed like God was telling you to do it, based on the scriptures." By that point, Jeffrey Lundgren had become a dictator. To quote Dennis, he would use the pattern to tell us what a scripture actually said and then ask us if we could see it. If anyone didn't see it, he would go over it again and again and again until everyone in the room finally agreed with what he said. One night, Jeffrey strode into class and ordered the class to open their Bibles to Malachi. He read this verse, "Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple." Commenting on this verse, he said, "It tells us that Christ shall suddenly come to his temple. The temple is in Kirtland. The messenger is preparing the way. As he noted, the last messenger would be sent by God to reveal the pattern to the world. That was how the members of the group would identify Jeffrey Lundgren as the messenger. Only the messenger would reveal the chiastic patterns. As Dennis Patrick deduced, Jeffrey was telling us that he was the last messenger. Eventually, Dennis and Tanya became accepted by the so-called family. Perhaps it was a calculated move to ensure that there would be no dabblers dipping in and out, taking a casual view of it all. He wanted devotees, and you could only fashion somebody into one if they truly wanted to belong to the group. Indeed, one night Jeffrey paid a visit to the Patrick's apartment to personally inform them that they were part of the family. He and Alice referred to their children as naturals. Dennis, Tanya, and their children were unnaturals. Jeffrey opened his Bible to the New Testament. He read a verse from the book of Acts, which spoke of how the early Christians lived communally with, quote, all things in common, end quote. The Patricks were totally up for it. They were then informed that Dennis must submit all his paychecks to Jeffrey, explaining how he would arrive at a figure for their monthly stipend. Jeffrey said, I want you to submit a monthly budget to me. I will decide how much money you need. Jeffrey asked Dennis what he had done with the proceeds of the sale of his house. Dennis told him he used the money to pay off outstanding bills. Jeffrey was infuriated. As Dennis recalled, Jeffrey got angry and told me that I had wasted the money. He said I should have given it to him instead of paying off a bunch of Gentiles. He was the one who was going to build Zion. Gentiles didn't matter. The only reason why God had put them on earth was so we could use them. Jeffrey convinced Dennis to fork over all his money. To quote Dennis, we felt we were going to build Zion and we wanted to do our part. I was willing to do whatever it took to do this right and see Christ. They would later learn that every member of Lundgren's group submitted their earnings to Jeffrey. Additionally, they would allow him to control their personal lives. He even ordered Richard to court and commit to a woman named Sharon, to whom he was not attracted. Richard was a fat phobe, and Sharon was overweight. But he obeyed Jeffrey, feeling it was for the greater good. Dennis Patrick withdrew all his savings and gave Jeffrey Lundgren $10,000 in cash. Jeffrey used some of the money to purchase guns. He was apparently on a survivalist kick, for he went on to buy camouflage clothing, tents, camping supplies, canned food, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He argued for this by stating that the book of Revelation urged Christians to stock provisions for their hour of tribulation. He felt that all these items needed to be kept in his so-called storehouse so that he would be prepared in the hour of Christ's return. All the men in the family were issued at least one gun. Onward, Christian soldiers indeed. He argued that the so-called armies of Satan would come for them at a time when there would be no electricity or running water, and they had to be ready to live like the pioneers. As far as the guns went, they were also prepared to kill to protect the temple. Reverend Dale Luffman, who was the stake president of that county's RLDS churches, disapproved of Jeffrey Lundgren's teaching methods and message. He told him in no uncertain terms that he would not be teaching at the church anymore. 2 weeks later, Lundgren was pontificating to his faithful at the spacious home of one of his students. The overseers of the temple's finances discovered that approximately $21,000 had gone missing during the time Jeffrey Lundgren had been working there. They went easy on him, telling him he could live at the cottage for one more month until he found another place. They also agreed not to make too much noise about what he had done. Instead of owning up to his thievery, Jeffrey said, "Whenever a prophet begins to prophesy, the people turn against him. The scriptures say that prophets are cast out. That is happening now. I am being cast out of the temple. I have been told to resign." Jeffrey Lundgren came up for a solution for his impending homelessness, and it didn't consist of living in a tent. Instead, he fell back on the commune idea. He began calling realtors in his quest to find a suitable tract of land to house the family. Before long, he was informed that a 5-bedroom farmhouse with 15 acres of land in southern Kirtland was up for sale. The arable land hadn't been farmed for a long time, and the structures had fallen into disrepair. But at a rental price of $650 per month, the price was right. Jeffrey declared that Kevin Curry, Richard Brand, Shar Olson, Danny Kraft, and Sharon Blunchley were joining the family. On Jeffrey's last day as a tour guide at the temple, he tallied up the day's receipts at $1,600. He was expected to deposit it at the bank, but told Bill Lord that he accidentally left it in his car, which was unlocked. Lord didn't believe it, but couldn't prove it wasn't true. He just accepted that it marked the last time he would interact with Jeffrey Lundgren. Shar Olson's recall the cult's salad days. "I felt a real sense of belonging. It began when we fixed up the house. We'd get off work, meet at the farm, and begin knocking down walls. We'd work until we dropped. Jeff would go buy us a bucket of chicken, and we'd sit on the floor covered with plaster and eat and laugh and talk about how we were going to make this all work and how we were going to bring about Zion. I really felt like we were becoming a family." Shar came to address Jeffrey as Dad and Alice as Mom. Shar and Danny were fixed up as a couple by the Lundgrens. Every night there were indoctrination classes in which Jeffrey would pontificate for 2 to 3 hours. If anybody made a mistake, they would have to sit through a lesson called a session. These could last into the wee hours of the morning. In the mind of Jeffrey Lundgren, there was no such thing as an honest mistake. They had to get the chiastic patterns right the first time. One member said, "But you didn't tell us how to do it." Jeffrey's reply, "You should have known without asking." As Ron put it, you had to become one heart and one mind with Jeffrey. Ron explained how the members of the family came to believe that Jeffrey Lundgren was a prophet. "It took some time and it took the classes to do it, but I came to believe that Jeff was the seer of the last days, the one that Malachi speaks of. He was the prophet of the last days, who had come to prepare the way for Christ's return." Everybody worked on the farm except Jeffrey and Alice. According to them, prophets are forbidden by God to have plebeian jobs because in doing so, they would be required to submit to another human being. The Lundgrens collected all of everybody's earnings. They were stingy when it came to spending money on the family. Even a Friday pizza night struck them as extravagant. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and Alice went out to dinner and had movie nights at the theater once a week. Jeffrey took to referring to the female members of the family as Alice's handmaidens because they had indeed become her servants. Jeffrey discovered a message in the scriptures that he considered to be important. It went, "The Lord of the vineyard said unto one of his servants." Using the chiastic method, he restructured it thusly. A. Saved my vineyard from. B. The hands of the destroyer. C. And the Lord of the vineyard. B. Said unto one of his servants. A. Go and gather together the residue of my servants. He concluded that the word servant was synonymous with destroyer because they were both on B lines and therefore mirrored each other. More alarmingly, Jeffrey announced, God is giving me a new name and a new job. Besides being the last messenger, I am now to be called the destroyer. People will die at my hands. The enemies that I am to destroy are the persons now in control of the vineyard. The vineyard in question was the Kirtland Temple. He said, Dale Luffman and the RLDS Church are the enemy. They are the wicked who have seized control of the vineyard. He read a verse from the scriptures. Go ye straightway unto the land of my vineyard, and redeem my vineyard, for it is mine. Avenge me of my enemies. Lundgren said to his followers, Ladies and gentlemen, God is commanding us to take over the Kirtland Temple. I am the destroyer. We must destroy the wicked who are now in control of the temple if we want Christ to return. And that is exactly what I intend to do. Lundgren began to indoctrinate his flock in the ways of warfare by showing them war movies like First Blood and Apocalypse Now. He told them about his tour of duty in Vietnam. He told them his nickname was Killer because he would do things like cut the ears off Viet Cong soldiers and keep them as souvenirs. As Shar recalled, Jeffrey convinced us that if a policeman was holding one of us as a shield, all we had to do was stand perfectly still and Jeffrey could shoot him between the eyes. It might make you deaf for a while, he told us, but otherwise you'll be okay. For those who wondered if it was truly okay to commit murder, he brought up a story from the scriptures about a skeptic of God who was murdered as punishment for his atheism. As Jeffrey pointed out, God is not afraid to kill. He went on, when God wanted to show that he had power, God killed the wicked. If I want to show that I have God's power, if I want to be endowed with that power, then I must kill the wicked. To quote Dennis Patrick, I had always believed in the scriptures. They couldn't be wrong, and everything Jeffrey showed us came directly out of the scriptures. He told them that Christ would only return if there was no wickedness occurring in or near the Kirtland Temple. He said that the only way to guarantee that such a scenario could be manifested would be to execute the wicked, or at least those who were wicked in his point of view. He wanted to bring the entire Luffman family into the temple and offer them up to God as a human sacrifice. All of them, even the children, would be beheaded, starting with Dale. As he put it, what better way to cut off a man from God than to sever his head from his body, making it impossible for him to use his intelligence? Alice was the first person to learn about Jeffrey's master plan in detail. The Bible and the Book of Mormon are full of violence, and Jeffrey felt that this gave him permission to commit murder, despite having been forbidden to do so by the 10 Commandments. One day Alice approached Jeffrey while he was reading military manuals. He would read pages and then tear them out, crumple them, and throw them into the fire. Commenting on this, Alice said, I couldn't figure out why he was destroying the book until later that night at class. He taught the military stuff like it was all his idea. He even taught the scriptures in a different way in his classes. As Alice noted, Jeffrey kept his open. I was sitting right next to him and could see what he was doing. He acted like he was reading a verse from one book, but I could see that he was taking a verse from one book and a verse from another book of scripture and combining them. He was making up his own scriptures. She confronted him about it, as she recalled. I said, "Since when do we start taking things out of context, Jeffrey?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Now, Jeffrey, this is Alice you're talking to. And I saw what you did. You were mixing and matching those verses." Jeffrey flew into a rage. To quote Alice, he said, "You shut up about this. You shut up." He started to shake me. I think that's when I first began to see that Jeffrey was a con man. I believed that he was giving everyone a line of baloney, and I decided the temple takeover stuff was bullshit. Kevin Curry had a different take on Alice, saying she was always Jeffrey's cheerleader, no matter what he said or did. Shar was troubled by Jeffrey's idea of killing the Luffman family. He never came across as facetious when he discussed that plan. To quote Shar, Alice looked right at me. She said, "Jeffrey is dead serious. If he says he's going to do it, he's going to do it. You've got to understand, I'm not only putting my life on the line here, but I've put my children's life on the line for this. Jeffrey is a prophet. He is who he says he is. You've got to believe it, and so do I. I've got to." Jeffrey assigned tasks to everyone. Everyone but him and Alice, of course. Richard was to obtain city maps that would show where gas and power lines would be found. Danny was to build a replica of houses around the temple and put numbers on the houses when people would be executed. Dennis only lived about a block away from the police station, so his charge was to monitor all police activity from the outside. Sharon cataloged a complete list of all the gas stations in the area. The purpose of this was that Jeffrey might blow a gas station up to create a diversion. The women were familiarized with guns and bullets and told they may have to reload the guns at night. All men were given code names. Jeffrey gave himself the code name Eagle 1. His explanation? "I am in charge, and my eyesight is as good as an eagle's." Damon was Eagle 2. Danny was Eagle Eye. Richard was Talon 1. Dennis was Talon 2. Ron was Falcon 1. Greg Falcon 2. The farmhouse was dubbed the Eagle's Nest. The red barn out back was Red Eagle. The temple was Eagle's Mound. A few days later, Jeffrey announced to the flock that he had been given a date for the executions and takeover. He said, "He told me it was posted somewhere in the temple, so I went to find it. I looked everywhere, and then God's wisdom came to me. If you go to see a doctor, how do you know when he will be in his office? You know by looking at the front door, because that is where a doctor posts his office hours. God has done the exact same thing. He posted the date that his temple will be redeemed right on the front doors. On the temple doors there were 5 circles, 2 large and 3 small. The 2 large symbolized the 2nd month of the Jewish calendar. The 3 represented days. Speaking conclusively, Jeffrey said, God is telling us that he wants us to take over his temple on May 3rd. Jeffrey asked the group if they knew why this date was significant. Alice had the answer. May 3rd is Jeffrey's birthday. Jeffrey's revelations were becoming a daily occurrence. He modified the takeover schedule. They would take over on the 1st of May and keep the police outside until the 3rd. The 3rd would be when Christ would appear. Jeffrey told them that they were going to have a shootout with the police. He also issued gas masks so that if the police used tear gas, they would be unaffected. They must have been disappointed when he declared that only 12 of them would survive the shootout and be there when Jesus emerged. His argument was that Jesus only had 12 disciples while he was alive. Alice and Damon were guaranteed they would survive, but only 9 of the remaining adults would live on. Shar recalled the effect this had on them. No one knew if they were on the list. It became very divisive and competitive. He told Shar that he would kill Kevin with a shotgun because he was unclean and therefore unworthy to greet Jesus. Dennis, Tony, and Molly would be killed and their bodies would be thrown from the roof of the temple. This would be done to show the police that he wasn't playing around. Despite all this, everyone who pulled Jeffrey aside and asked him in confidence if they were going to be there for Christ's return were reassured that they would be. Kevin recalled the effect Jeffrey's beliefs were having on the rest of the commune. I realized just how important all this was to him, how important being a prophet had become. I also realized that he was drawing off our energies. Each time someone new came into the group, Jeffrey gained more confidence in himself. He figured that he was right, that he was a prophet. We were feeding off his fantasy, and he was feeding off our fantasy. And together we were creating an even bigger and bigger fantasy that was beginning to take on a life of its own. Kevin concluded on his own that Jeffrey did indeed plan to kill him. One night, the commune had a chocolate sheet cake for dessert. 9-year-old Kristen asked who had a birthday. Jeffrey told her it was Kevin's going-away cake. A few days later, Kevin's car was found at a bus station. When Jeffrey found out about this, he said, "That son of a bitch has run off. Kevin's as good as dead. I'm going to track him down and kill him." For the next few days, Jeffrey was fuming over Kevin's departure. He continued to openly muse over killing him. Apparently only Jeffrey had the right to kill Kevin. Jeffrey would say things like, "He's in Buffalo hiding. I could get up there and do him and be back overnight." Jeffrey gave up after searching for Kevin. He declared at the end of this effort, "Whether he dies at my hand or whether he dies because I say the prayer that raises the mountain and causes the earthquake really doesn't matter. Kevin is dead to God." Jeffrey's cousin Debbie came to live at the farmhouse and to get involved in the takeover. She became romantically involved with Greg. Jeffrey felt Greg was preordained to be her companion. April 22nd. Jeffrey finalized the details of the takeover. The men would wear camouflage outfits. Their faces would be painted black. They would hike through the apple orchard out back and follow a right-of-way owned by the electric company behind the RLDS property. They would then split into 2 groups. Ron, Dennis, and Greg would invade the temple. Danny, Richard, Damon, and Jeffrey would go from house to house, killing all the occupants. They would abduct the Luthmans and bring them to the temple. By that point, the women and children would be inside. Jeffrey would personally behead the Luthmans, even to the point of bringing down his machete to a small child begging for mercy. Because according to Jeffrey Lundgren, that's what Jesus would want. Jeffrey had been practicing his machete swing in front of the occupants of the Eagle's Nest. After Jeffrey would say a then secret prayer, the men would engage in the shootout with police. To him, the ends justified the means, and on May 3rd, the mountain of the Lord would rise up, Jesus would appear, and bless the 12 remaining followers. He bought Alice a 9mm pistol so that she could join in the fun. For her to cast aspersions on Jeffrey because of the things he did only makes her a hypocrite. As the so-called prophet's wife, she enjoyed the status the title conferred upon her. Kevin contacted the FBI and Kirtland police. Though both agencies found his allegations far-fetched, they took it seriously nonetheless. Some officers put together a stakeout for the Eagle's Nest. Kevin told the police chief that the takeover would take place between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. The police chief contacted the RLDS church and asked them about Jeffrey. They told him that he had stolen from the church and that he had hated Dale Luffman. To quote the chief, "I didn't want to tell him that we knew about the takeover because then he would have figured out that Kevin had called us. But I wanted Jeffrey to know that he was being watched." The chief paid a visit to the commune. He said to Jeffrey, "We've had some complaints about paramilitary groups being spotted in your orchard. Have you seen them?" "No." "Probably guys playing war games with paint guns. We'd appreciate you keeping an eye out for them." "Sure." The chief said, "Of course, we'll be watching for them too." The chief noted later that Jeffrey came across as anxious. The chief asked him if he owned any guns. Jeffrey said he owned a couple for hunting and some black-powdered firearms that he collected. As the chief put it, Jeffrey had, quote, dancing eyes. As the chief recalled, he kept glancing around. He was like a frightened rabbit. May 1st, the chief and his staff staked out the temple and the RLDS church. Nothing happened. It was the same on the 2nd and 3rd. Jeffrey's explanation for why they were unable to carry out the takeover was that each member of the family, except for him, were sinners and needed to cleanse themselves. One member who would not be joining them for the takeover was Shar. She became disillusioned when she realized Jeffrey was full of shit, so she left. Meanwhile, because of the dimensions of Alice's vagina due to childbirth, Jeffrey insisted on anal intercourse. After a lifetime of abstaining from alcohol due to her religious beliefs, Alice became a daily drinker. The rest of the flock became aware of Jeffrey's new predilection toward anal sex, so they assumed that if she was drunk, there must be a connection between the two. She also developed a dependency on painkillers. She would get drunk enough and he would use her blood as lubricant, hence the painkillers. In search of other verses to justify his drive to commit murder, Jeffrey discovered and read aloud to the group this verse from the Doctrine and Covenants. "Behold, vengeance cometh speedily upon the inhabitants of the earth, and upon my house shall it begin. First among those among you who have professed to know my name and have not known me." Yes, Jeffrey surmised from this verse that he was to sacrifice someone from his so-called house, a person or persons who claimed to know the Lord but did not. Dale Luffman persuaded Shar to meet with him in a restaurant to discuss Jeffrey Lundgren and his activities. She told him about the plot to take over the temple and murder his family. Dale reached out to the police station immediately after the meeting. He said to the leading officer on duty, "Jeffrey Lundgren is running a cult and is planning on killing me and my family." Shar gave lots of detailed information, everything from the firearms that Lundgren owned to the scriptures that he felt justified his move to murder the Luffmans and seize the temple. Jeffrey Lundgren was served excommunication papers from the RLDS for encouraging members to leave and teaching doctrine that was contrary to the church's beliefs. Typical of the excommunication process, Lundgren was entitled to a hearing to argue against his ejection. Dale Luffman served him the papers in person. He said, "Do us both a favor, Jeff. Don't bother fighting this." Jeffrey said, "I'll think about it." After seeing a double rainbow in the sky following a rainstorm, Jeffrey took it as a sign that the first seal mentioned in the book of Revelation had been opened. He also felt and conveyed to the flock that he was to be God's messenger during the hour of Armageddon. To quote Jeffrey, "I am God's prophet. I am the last messenger. I am the destroyer. I am the rider of the white horse. God has chosen me to open the seals." In recognition of his self-appointed responsibility to open the rest of the seals, he loosely quoted a verse from the scriptures. The rider of the red horse is required by God to show blood. His job is to kill. This verse in Revelation is another sign from God that my job is to destroy the wicked. He decided that everything he learned from Scripture using the chiastic method brought together pieces of a puzzle that had finally fit together. He claimed God told him in the parable of the vineyard to kill. Furthermore, if he wanted power, God-like power, he would have to kill. By the way, in the mafia, you have to kill someone to, quote-unquote, make your bones so you can become a made man. He had crafted the image of God as being like a mob boss, and the so-called wicked would get whacked. Sealing the deal, Jeffrey said, "I checked and checked the scriptures over and over, and all they kept coming back to was the same thing. There was absolutely no doubt whatsoever about what God was commanding me to do." The rainbow appeared to him in October 1988, and he would go on to say that he would have to carry out the human sacrifice in 6 months. April 1989 would be the time when it would be incumbent upon him to, quote, show blood. He decided that the Avery family would be sacrificed, since they moved to Madison and stopped attending his classes. Eventually, the Averys started attending his classes again. This didn't throw a kink in his plans, and he still devised his scheme to kill them all. The flock were not to discuss this within earshot of the Averys, and were to act as if nothing untoward was going on. Richard Brand later told authorities that human sacrifice was all the group talked about when the Averys were absent. As Brand put it, "We constantly talked about shedding of blood, that it had to be done, that we were going to the wilderness, we were going to see God there." In Lundgren's words, the Averys had been, quote, taken by the devil, end quote, because they didn't support his view of the scriptures, which he felt was the ultimate word and the truth. There would then be a period when Jeffrey had to decide how to kill the Averys. He found the solutions in the Old Testament. The men were to be beheaded. The women were to be stripped bare and split open until they were disemboweled, with their entrails and internal organs pulled out. Children were to be picked up by their feet and swung against a wall until their heads were cracked open. Again, that's in the fucking Bible. Jeffrey organized the males into an army of Israel, and the family even had their own flag. He amassed an arsenal including 4,000 rounds of ammunition. He began to prepare everyone for life in the wilderness following the sacrifice, since the police and federal law enforcement would be on the hunt for them. Another group that was likely to be on the hunt for them were creditors, for Jeffrey urged everyone to get as many credit cards as they could. He had already blown his credit, but he liked the idea of charging all their cards to the max and sticking it to the, quote, Gentiles, as he called them. Jeffrey was reading the Book of Mormon when he discovered a story about a Mormon general who lost 10 of his troops during combat as they fought to protect the golden plates bearing the scriptures that LDS Church founder Joseph Smith Jr. was to discover in the 19th century. Jeffrey interpreted this to mean that he was to kill 10 people as opposed to the original 5. He began mentally ranking each group member according to their sins. He decided to kill Dennis, Tanya, and their daughter Molly. Richard, Sharon, and the Avery family also fell within his crosshairs. This information was leaked to everyone in the group except those with targets on their backs. In the court of Jeffrey Lundgren, there was no public hearing. There were no opportunities for atonement. Not just suicide, but every sin was unforgivable. He was an unforgiving man and a tyrant, so it is hardly surprising that he would rule the nest with the sensibility of Kim Jong-un. His latest misinterpretation of scriptures came when he read, "I will make thy horn iron, and I will make thy hoofs brass." Given the metallic motif, he assumed this meant that killing the group members with gunshots would be more practical. He planned to put all 10 of them in a pit and kill them in firing squad formation, as he felt this would result in a more efficient kill. At the time, Alice didn't believe Jeffrey would actually follow through with the executions, or so she says. "I didn't think he would kill anybody, because he would come up with these wild-haired plans all the time, and he didn't carry through with them. I thought this was just another one of his insane ideas, like the Kirtland temple takeover, or like the obtaining of the golden plates, or obtaining the sword of Laban, saying words and making an earthquake happen." Jeffrey was aware of this and of the fact that other group members held the same opinion. To quote Jeffrey, "I made it clear that I was serious about this, and I was not joking, but I could tell that some of them didn't take it serious, no matter how many times I warned them about God's wrath and fury. They just didn't get it. Even Alice didn't understand that this was not a joke, that I was going to do exactly what I said." Still, it was not just Jeffrey who was willing to slay the impure among their ranks. Shar had become a witness for the FBI, and she agreed to have lunch with Greg Winship while secretly wearing a wire. When Shar asked him if he would kill for the cause, he said, "If God can tell Nephi to go slay Laban, then he can tell me to go kill whomever." He did point out that he wanted to be sure that it was God ordering the hit. As Greg put it, We're talking 10 years to life, and I'm not ready to do that. I'm not ready to run out and kill somebody, but I'm definitely thinking about it, whereas I wouldn't have even thought about it before. Greg was less clear on when exactly Jeffrey would launch his attack on the temple. Later, Shar would call him while her telephone was tapped with her knowledge. Greg was not nearly as generous with information on the eagle's nest this time around. Jeffrey had spotted a strange van parked outside the house one day, and now everybody had become even more mistrustful of outsiders. April 17th, Jeffrey informed Alice that the Patrick family and Sharon and Richard would be spared. Jeffrey drove to the Patrick's home. He had bittersweet news for Sharon, as Sharon tells it. Jeff told me that Dennis was not getting his act together, that he was sinful, but that I was doing all right, and he had no problems with me, and because of that, Dennis wasn't going to be killed. He told me that he had planned to kill Dennis, Molly, and me that night, but not now. I was in shock. Alice interjected. To quote Sharon, Alice told me how worried she'd been about it and how happy she was that I was saved. Imagine someone telling you they were about to kill you but thought better of it. How comforting is that exactly? Meanwhile, on Jeffrey's orders, Greg made a reservation for the Averys at a motel. Jeffrey didn't want their last forwarding address to be the Eagle's Nest. The family had the Averys over for one last meal. It was an upsetting situation for everybody except Jeffrey and the Averys. Knowing their friends were about to be unceremoniously slaughtered was difficult to fathom. Jeffrey summoned all the men except for Dennis Avery to his bedroom. He picked up his .45 pistol. As Jeffrey put it, everyone had done their part. Now I wanted them to know that I was going to do mine. He asked them, "Are you in or are you out?" All the men nodded. Jeffrey said, "Okay, let's do it." By the time Dennis finished eating, and he was a notoriously slow eater, all the men in the house had gone out to the barn. Ron came into the house and announced to Dennis that Jeffrey had sent for him. Unbeknownst to Dennis, Ron had a 50,000-watt stun gun in his pocket. Moments later, Ron recalled what happened when Dennis Avery entered the barn. When Dennis walked through the door of the barn, I lifted his shirt and tried to use the stun gun a couple of different places. Jeffrey told Ron that the stun gun would only work if Dennis were tased on his hip, chest, or neck. Ron blasted all 3 sites with 50,000 watts. The tasing must have been painful regardless, for Dennis, typically of a placid demeanor, began to scream at Ron, saying, "What are you doing? God damn it, this isn't necessary." As Ron noted, all the stun gun was doing was causing a lot of pain. With this phase of the execution having gone bust, the rest of the men tackled Dennis and pushed him down to the ground. They placed tape on his hands, feet, and mouth. They didn't put duct tape on his eyes, to quote Richard, because he was supposed to see Jeff when Jeff shot him. Jeffrey was waiting by a pit that was dug in the dirt floor in an adjacent room on the west side of the barn, with gun in hand. He felt more empowered to carry out the murder than ever before because of Dennis's use of the word "goddamn." As Jeffrey said, Dennis had cursed God. He was clearly under Satan's power. Richard lifted Dennis up by his shoulders while Danny grabbed his feet. They carried him to the pit and dumped him in. When Dennis looked up, Jeffrey was looking down at him with the .45 in his hand. The fact that Jeffrey was setting an example no better than what you would expect from the devil was apparently lost on him. To quote Jeffrey, "I looked him in the eyes because I wanted him to know who was sending him before God for his wickedness." Jeffrey said the scriptures required him to look Dennis in the eye and, quote, pierce his heart. It was Greg's charge to run a chainsaw outside the barn during the shootings so that they could not be heard. He had yet to begin, and Jeffrey was impatient. Jeffrey fired 2 shots into the pit, and everybody in the barn could hear them as the sound blistered the air. Boasting later, Jeffrey recalled, "I fired 2 shots directly into his heart." Apparently, having failed to relish the carnage, Ron said, "Is it done?" Jeffrey said, "All right, everybody, come look at this. Come see what death is." Damon recalled what he saw when the men arrived at the lip of the pit. "When I looked in, Dennis was laying there on the ground. You could see blood all over his shirt. I started crying. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen anything like that before. It was my own father that had just did that." Part of Jeffrey's plan was to clear out the Averys' motel room of their belongings so that people would think they had simply left town. He said, "Damon, get the key out of his pocket." Damon said, "I can't do it. I can't believe he is dead. I can't believe he is dead." Damon was so shocked by the murder, he began to cry again. Jeffrey walked over to Damon and put his arm around him while holding the gun in his other hand. He said, "It's okay. You're growing up at an early age." Ron volunteered to get the motel key. Jeffrey returned to the barn after getting the motel room key from Cheryl. He took mercy on Damon and let him act as lookout. Once everybody had reestablished their positions, Jeffrey said, "Okay, Ron, bring out the next one. Bring out Cheryl." Debbie was with Cheryl when Ron entered the house. To quote Debbie, Ron told Cheryl that Dennis needed her help in the barn, so she left with him. When Cheryl entered the barn, Richard, Greg, and Danny surrounded her. Ron said to her, "Be calm, don't struggle, just give it up." The men wrapped tape around Cheryl's ankles, hands, mouth, and eyes. Jeffrey didn't want her eyes to be uncovered, likely so that she could report after dying that it had been Jeffrey Lundgren who had personally dispatched her to the afterlife. Debbie heard the chainsaw from the house. Cheryl was carried to the hoary netherworld of Jeffrey Lundgren's pit and dropped in. Jeffrey aimed and fired. As the autopsy reported, she had been shot twice in the right breast and once in the abdomen. Jeffrey switched ammunition halfway through the killing. He wanted to experiment and see which type of bullet was most effective. He justified this with scriptures too. According to the scriptures, I was going to kill again. I wanted to learn as much as I could from this experience. Apparently, this would not be nearly enough to slake Jeffrey Lundgren's thirst for blood, for he openly mused about the possibility of going into the pit and stabbing the corpses after they were air-holed. His justification for doing so, as he put it, just to see what it would feel like. The coroner estimated that Cheryl lived for another 5 minutes before succumbing to her injuries. Neighbors later testified that they heard both a chainsaw and gunshots at the time, but didn't assume it was suspicious because night hunting was not unheard of in that area. Jeffrey said to the men, Bring out the next one. Ron came into the house and informed 15-year-old Trina Avery that her mother needed her in the barn. In the barn, Damon yelled, "Here she comes!" Trina had barely penetrated the inner environs of the barn before the men surrounded her. Ron informed her they were going to play a game. Many games had been played in the barn, so she didn't suspect that anything nefarious was afoot. The men taped her feet and hands before wrapping it around her face. To allay any misgivings she might have had, one of them said, "It's just like the three monkeys. See no evil, hear no evil, say no evil." As the men carried Trina, they were unable to tell how she felt about it since she had practically been mummified by tape. Just then, Richard tripped on a cord that fed power to a light bulb. The bulb fell to the floor and broke. Jeffrey was plunged into darkness, much like his soul. He ordered Richard to replace the bulb. Richard and Ron put Trina down in a pile of dirt and garbage. Ron did all he could to assure her she had nothing to worry about. Once the light was back on, Trina was carried to the pit and dropped in. Because Jeffrey shot her parents in the torso, he decided to shoot Trina in the skull. He fired a shot, which apparently missed or just grazed her head, for she cried out in pain. Jeffrey fired 2 shots into her back. Trina sagged forward. She was stationary, so he decided he didn't need to shoot her again. Now it was time for Dennis and Cheryl's 2 remaining children, Karen and Becky. Ron told both girls that there were horses in the barn and asked them if they wanted to see them. The girls leapt at the chance, though Ron told them he could only take one at a time. Being the baby in the family, Karen was used to being chosen last, so Becky was the first to see the horses. Becky saw the duct tape and quickly surmised that there was something insidious about the men's intentions. She said, "What's going on?" To quote Richard, "We told her that we were just playing a game and that she was going for a ride." Wasting no time, Richard and Ron carried her to the pit and put her in. After the first shot, Jeffrey saw that she was still breathing, though she had been knocked to the ground. Jeffrey described the impact the next shot made. "I fired again, and when the shot hit her, her hands, which had been in her lap, went forward as if she was reaching to touch her mother's body, as if she instinctively knew that her mother was there beside her." Ron went off to summon Karen as Jeffrey reloaded. Karen wasn't scared until the men wrapped the duct tape around her head, whereupon they carried her to the pit and dropped her in. Jeffrey had so far fired bullets into the back, breasts, skull, and legs. Jeffrey detailed how he handled the murder of Karen Avery. "I fired straight down into her skull. I was less than 2 feet away, and I pulled the trigger. Bang, bang. Her body jumped and then slumped over upon impact." 11 p.m. Jeffrey ordered the men to dump lime onto the corpses. Once the lime was spread, they dumped rocks and dirt on the bodies to conceal them. Jeffrey ended the day by walking out to the apple orchard and saying a prayer. As he described it, "I walked into the apple orchard and looked up at the heavens and said a prayer. God, I said, I have been thy sword of judgment this day. May my offering be acceptable. May all I've done be acceptable to you this day." Then I went inside and cleaned up. The women were instructed to go to the motel room and clear out the Avery's possessions. Alice found a drawing made by Karen. It depicted a rainbow and some ponies. Karen made it for Alice and wrote, "To Alice, I love you, Karen." Alice put it in the garbage with everything else. Jeffrey began that night's class with this verse from the Book of Mormon. "Behold, the Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purposes." Nobody else felt vindicated. They felt guilty about the murders. Others feared retribution from Jeffrey in the event that they might disobey him. He had proven that he would not hesitate to kill them for it, so now he ruled through fear. Even Alice's perspective was dour. She said to the group, "Our lives are over. Life as we know it is gone. We are wanderers and strangers in a strange land." Debbie remembered Alice's address differently. She said, "Alice told us, you need to be thankful for this man." She was talking about Jeff. She said, "He is going to take you to see God. He did this for you. He killed these people so you could see God." She was playing the role of cheerleader, just as she always did for him. Jeffrey informed the women of the importance of comforting their men that night. He said, "This is just the beginning. The scriptures say we will have to kill many, many more." They had no reason to doubt him. Later that night, neither Jeffrey nor Alice could sleep. They had a brief conversation. As Alice recalled, "At one point during the night, Jeffrey asked me if I were asleep, and I said no. And then I said, 'Oh, Jeff, why did you have to do it?' And he was quiet, and then he said, 'It was the will of God.' Jeffrey truly believed. He thought he was becoming divine. There was never any show of doubt. He genuinely believed that he was exactly who he said he was based on his reading of the scriptures. The FBI and local police searched the Eagle's Nest property. They didn't have a warrant, but Jeffrey allowed them to search to avoid appearing suspicious. Special Agent Robert Alvord wrote the following report based on the search. Lundgren advised that he believes that a judgment day is at hand, but it is at the hand of the Lord and not his. And Lundgren finds no justification in the scriptures for violently taking the temple or killing other individuals. He advised that he does not consider himself a prophet, but does consider himself a teacher. Lundgren advised that the camouflage uniforms were for hunting, and the stun gun was purchased for his wife for her own personal protection. The gas masks are used for spray painting and refinishing. Lundgren advised that he does a great deal of hunting, and his father was a collector of guns, and he has just continued the tradition. The fact that the FBI hadn't been able to find out about the murder of the Averys gave Jeffrey the impression that he could do such a thing without repercussions in perpetuity. He said to Alice, "Now do you have any doubt that I am who I say I am?" Recalling this moment, she said later, Jeffrey considered the fact that the FBI didn't know about the Averys a direct confirmation of the fact that he could do anything he wanted and do it right under their noses. Further reinforcing this point, Jeffrey said, "God has promised me that he will protect my back. We don't have to worry. The Lord is with us." After throwing all damning evidence into the fireplace, everyone picked up and headed eastward toward West Virginia. After everything that had happened, Debbie was optimistic about the future. She said, "He was going to take us to see God face to face. And I was really looking forward to that moment." Jeffrey's caravan stopped in the small town of Davis, which was located in the Canaan Valley district. There was a motel called the Highlander, which he saw as significant since he had seen the movie Highlander multiple times and misinterpreted it as much as he had misinterpreted the scriptures. He discovered an area called Yellow Creek Hollow, an area of isolated, undeveloped forest. It was ideal for his purposes, since he and his followers could camp out there undisturbed by police, the FBI, or anyone else. It was also plentiful in natural resources, like wild animals, fish, and other ways in which a self-sustaining person could live off the grid. They settled near a stream once they got past an area that was frequented by local sports fishermen. On May 3rd, Jeffrey's birthday, Jeffrey pulled up to the camp on an all-terrain vehicle and made an announcement to the family after a trip to a mountain nearby. "Jesus Christ appeared to me." He said Jesus descended from heaven in a beam of light and told him he was pleased that he sacrificed the Averys and approved of the fact that they ventured into West Virginia. He continued, "I have taken on Christ's name. I am not Jesus Christ, but because I have taken on the task that he has commanded me to do, I can be like Jesus Christ, and he has given me the title of God of the whole earth." He claimed to be immortal and impervious to injury. He went on, "I am the law. There is no other law. There is no other law. Would you question Jesus Christ? Then do not try to tell the God of the whole earth what to do." To defy this principle was a sin, according to the self-righteous gospel of Jeffrey Lundgren. When everybody except Jeffrey and Alice wasn't doing chores, their noses were buried in Scripture. They had the means to generate enough electricity to cook and watch videos, but for the most part, they were a faith-based hunter-gatherer society, complete with real hunting by the men who took to the forest every day with rifles. Dennis Patrick and Jeffrey Lundgren were not exactly on the same page when it came to the Avery murders. Dennis was so remorseful he fell into a deep and lasting depression. This irked Jeffrey. He viewed the slaying as a triumph. Eventually, everybody else began to criticize Dennis. As Kathy Johnson remarked in retrospect, "It may sound like a minor thing, but if Dennis couldn't obey a simple command, how could anyone count on him to obey a big one?" The goal of the group was to become one heart and one mind with Jeffrey so we could see God. Dennis was keeping us from that. The night during his scripture class, Jeffrey turned to Debbie and said, "How long would it take for Dennis to die? If I strapped him to a tree and shot him in the balls?" Dennis was nearby and he heard it all. He was ashen. Jeffrey pulled out his .45. Dennis thought he was going to die right there and then. To quote Dennis, "Jeffrey said that I wasn't being a man because I wasn't taking responsibility for keeping the commandments of God. So if I were to have seed, that seed would be bad seed. He said he was going to destroy my seed by shooting off my balls, and that he was going to let me die a slow and agonizing death." Dennis was sweating bullets as Jeffrey aimed them at him. To quote Jeffrey, "I was going to shoot him. I had thought that my people had learned their lesson, but Dennis still didn't get it. I am not joking around. God had ordered me to destroy the wicked, and Dennis was clearly one of them. Dennis begged for another chance to get it right. Jeffrey said, "Okay." And that was that. Dennis's punishments were that Tanya and Molly would not sleep in his tent for a while and would reside with Jeffrey and Alice. The men confiscated the guns Dennis had been using. They were also instructed to watch over him at night to ensure he would not escape, as Jeffrey suspected him of disloyalty. As Dennis put it, every second after that, I was being watched, and my every move, my every comment was reported directly to Jeffrey. The next few days, Jeffrey talked openly about killing Dennis. He even said he might order the men to dig a pit in which he would be buried. Jeffrey once threatened to kill Dennis in his sleep. As Dennis put it, Jeffrey said he was going to have all the men surround my tent at night and simply open fire. Dennis became paranoid. I lay awake for hours at night in the quiet, and every time I heard a twig break or a leaf rustle, I'd wonder if they were coming to kill me. He thought about getting hold of a gun and killing Jeffrey as a preemptive measure, but he just didn't have it in him. He also ditched the idea of escaping. To quote Dennis, "I didn't want to leave Tanya and Molly behind. Besides, if I went to the police and told them what kind of weapons Jeffrey had, there was going to be an armed attack, and I didn't want Tanya and Molly killed." He didn't see suicide as an option either. Deep down, I still believed Jeffrey was a prophet, and I really wanted to do everything right. I believed that Jeffrey could lead me to the Lord. Jeffrey told Tanya she was chosen to be his second wife, a message he claimed to receive from above, though it is more likely to have been pulled straight from his ass. Either way, Tanya accepted the God as pimp notion with Jeffrey as her only trick. Jeffrey did not pursue this with Alice's consent and knowledge, and she didn't find out until one day when she saw Jeffrey walking hand in hand with Tanya. They stopped to kiss. That was the biggest giveaway, but up until then, Tanya had stopped wearing her bathrobe in their tent, and Alice viewed her other indiscretions around Jeffrey as suspect. When she confronted Jeffrey about it, he denied the affair. After lying to Alice about what she witnessed, he searched the scriptures for permission to commit adultery. He said God had ordered him to, quote, pierce Tanya. He said he could either do it with his penis or with a gun. He let Alice decide. Alice gave her appraisal. Jeffrey said it didn't really matter to him which I chose, and I believed that he was ready to shoot Tanya and Molly. Alice was considered by Jeffrey to be disobedient to God because of her objections to his affair with Tanya. Alice had to accept their relationship, but it caused her a great deal of anguish. In the middle of a scripture class, Jeffrey pulled out his pistol and pointed it at Dennis. He extorted his consent to allow Jeffrey to take Tanya as his second wife. Dennis didn't object. After all, Jeffrey didn't issue idle threats. After Tanya was established as one of Jeffrey's wives, Jeffrey took Alice on a ride with his ATV. He drove several miles until they stopped at a stream. He told her to remove her clothes. Once she was naked, he instructed her to disrobe him. Alice described what happened once they were both in the nude. "I thought we were going to make love, but instead, Jeffrey had a bowel movement, and he instructed me to cover him with his own feces, leaving just enough for him to use to masturbate with. I did as he commanded, and then he told me to tell him how beautiful he was, how wonderful he looked with all of this feces on him. I did this while he masturbated. Apparently, fecal matter was Jeffrey Lundgren's real sacrament. He was unable to climax, even under these conditions, which he would have considered to be ideal. He elicited Alice's help. To quote Alice, he took some of the feces and put it in his own mouth, but he didn't swallow it. A lot of saliva come out, and he pulled me up and made me kiss him on the lips, and then he told me to perform oral sex on him without washing any of the feces off. Alice did her best to oblige, but she soon became nauseous to the point of gagging. As she recalled, he grabbed me and pushed his penis into my mouth and told me not to stop again for any reason. He told me to swallow everything, told me that I couldn't spit. I went on with it until he had obtained orgasm. For further evidence that the man was insane, Alice recounted what happened next. I was told to give him a bath, and he told me that I had been obedient and that I was forgiven, and he thanked me for being a pure wife, and I said, okay. And then he told me that he loved me. Back at the camp, Alice was ordered by Jeffrey to tidy up the sleeping arrangements so that he could have sex with Tanya. Following this, he burst into the makeshift toilet while Tanya was doing her business. He told her he wanted her to get to the tent immediately. She may have been in the middle of having a bowel movement, but Jeffrey Lundgren was the last man who would have objected to the sights and smells. He was unable to follow through on sex with Tanya. He said it was because she wasn't, as he put it, flesh of my flesh. Or maybe it was the absence of feces. She wasn't ready for that. Most people are never ready for that. Polygamy is a standard marital situation in most cults, and so it was with Jeffrey Lundgren's family. Considering the prospects of watching some woman become Jeffrey's third wife, Debbie recalled Alice saying, "If Jeffrey wants me to be his doormat, then I'll be happy the rest of my life cleaning his shoes. He is my master, and I live only to serve his desires." It was about that time that Jeffrey told Alice that he had a dream in which God showed him a disembodied vagina and assigned him the mission of finding it. As part of his first effort to claim the rest of the women, Jeffrey called all the women except for Alice and Tanya. He told them their sin was pride and that they needed to be literally stripped of it. He told them to perform stripteases for the God of the whole earth. He justified it by reading chapter 32 of Isaiah, verse 11. "Tremble, ye women that are at ease. Be troubled, ye careless ones. Strip, make you bare, and gird sackcloth upon your loins." Jeffrey interpreted the word tremble as insinuating that a dance must be part of the ritual, hence the striptease. Jeffrey announced that he would masturbate and ejaculate into the dancer's panties, saying, "This will be the same as when Christ shed his blood." After soiling the panties, the woman was to wear the panties for the rest of the day. There was a caveat, a big one. If he didn't manage to ejaculate, he would not be able to purify that woman of her sins, and would therefore be compelled to kill her. Alice summed it up by saying he was using the scriptures to get what he wanted, which was to see all of the women's vaginas so he could find the one in his dream. However, when asked why she didn't call Jeffrey out on his bullshit at the time, she said, "Jeff made it perfectly clear to me that if this was not successful, children were going to die." Sharon remembers Alice's reaction differently. As Sharon recounted, Alice said that Jeffrey was afraid that we were going to mock him, that we were going to make light of it. And Alice said, "You're not going to do that to him." She said, "If I have to, I'll beat you to make you do this, and I don't care if it takes hours and hours. You're going to get through it." Jeffrey set aside a day when all the women would striptease. Alice described how it went down with a woman named Susie. The night before the dances, when we were having sex, Jeffrey told me that he wanted to fantasize, and he asked me to tell him what Susie was going to do when she danced in front of him the next day. I said Susie was going to masturbate, and then the next day he made me tell each woman when they came in that they were going to have to, quote, "come unto the Lord," literally. After Susie danced for 45 minutes, Jeffrey ejaculated into her panties. After a few minutes, he put his sweatpants on. He said to her, "Are you stripped of pride, my daughter?" Susie said, "Behold." She fell to the tent floor, face down at Jeffrey's feet. He said, "Arise and come forth." They embraced. Alice held up a written verse for Jeffrey to recite. "Unto thee I have shed my blood for thee. I have bought you with a price. I have washed thee and sanctified thee. This day thou hast preserved thyself and thy seed through my blood forever." Susie gave him the reply that was dictated to her by Alice. "Yea, Lord, I know that thou speakest the truth." Alice recalled the aftermath. Susie was told that she could get dressed. All the women were to dress slowly in front of Jeff, because you neither rushed into the presence of the Lord or rushed out of his presence. After taking in the dances over a period of 2 to 3 days, Jeffrey took a trip to the mountain on the ATV to cleanse himself of his compartmentalized sins. When he returned, he buttonholed Keith so that he could have a private conversation. As Keith recalled, he told me that Dennis had to die. I asked him how much time Dennis had, and Jeffrey said, "Not long." Jeffrey said it was because Dennis did not have anyone to dance on his behalf and was therefore infected with sin. Kathy offered to dance on Dennis's behalf, but this only enraged Jeffrey since he had discussed Dennis's fate in confidence. It was disobedience, or peradventuring, as Jeffrey called it. Now Jeffrey was getting closer to his ultimate plan to kill Dennis. Keith was nearly killed by Jeffrey, but at the last minute he offered an alternative to murder. He proposed that he pierce Kathy with his penis. Alice was jealous, but she accepted the situation. She let Jeffrey drop excrement on her. Why wouldn't she put up with his shit in this scenario? While Jeffrey and Kathy were having sex, he told her mid-thrust that he loved her. Many guys say this before they come, and for about 10 seconds they might even believe it. But it seemed as though it was true on this occasion. Jeffrey claimed to have felt a tenderness toward Kathy, a line he had used on other women. It worked. She fell head over heels in love with him. Jeffrey was so taken with Kathy, he decided to ditch Tanya. Jeffrey continued to rearrange his interpretations of the scriptures so that they would convey what he wanted to hear. He was especially fixated on sex and would do his utmost to justify his entitlement to the sexual congress he craved. One day while reading 1 Samuel chapter 17, he used the chiastic method to analyze the text. He was reading about how King Saul's son Jonathan loved David. Jeffrey told Greg in confidence that Chiasmus concluded that Jonathan and David were homosexual lovers. Jeffrey went on to say that he took it as a sign that he and Greg should have a homosexual affair. He conveniently forgot to mention the anti-gay verses of the book of Leviticus. Greg told Debbie that night about what Jeffrey had told him. Greg is not gay, but he was obedient to Jeffrey, so he was terrified about the possible outcomes of this scenario. To quote Debbie, Greg was not interested in Jeffrey at all, and he was worried about what Jeffrey might demand. It was like no one was safe from Jeffrey's sexual fantasies. This was a valid concern. Jeffrey convinced Alice to let him use her body as a canvas to finger paint with his own shit. Why wouldn't he find a way to pack Greg's fudge? Richard was also privy to Jeffrey's homosexual inclinations. One day in the barn, he found a dildo and a book of gay pornography. Sex became more and more of a focal point during the scripture classes. Jeffrey told everybody that the prophet Isaiah was a cross-dresser. He said Jesus was a womanizer who masturbated as a child. He was clearly looking for more people to engage in scat with him, for he quoted verses from Isaiah, those being 17 through 24. Isaiah examined his women's, quote, secret parts, end quote, and made them foul-smelling instead of imbuing them with a sweet scent. Though most group members didn't realize what he was getting at, Alice knew full well that he thought he had found justification for scat, and that he expected other women to indulge him in his fetish. Jeffrey convinced Kathy that she should abandon her husband Keith and their children to move into Jeffrey's tent and commit herself to satisfying his desires. To quote Kathy, "It really didn't make any sense for me to deny the truth. If I was flesh of Jeff's flesh, then I wasn't doing Keith any favors by living with him in sin." Jeffrey realized that the group needed to move on. Fall was inching toward winter, and the cold made it too uncomfortable to live in tents. A police helicopter hovered over the campsite twice, so they now knew the authorities were on to them. Jeffrey assigned new places for the various members to go on the lam. One day he returned home from an ATV trip with Kathy, and they had not gone just to pray. Alice knew what it was all about, and she was furious. She had had it with his infidelities. She screamed at him, "You son of a bitch!" The rest of the adults became an audience to her address. She said to them, "Here is your almighty God. You can have him." Alice's disenchantment with Jeffrey erupted. She said to him, shouting, "Don't say anything to me, Jeffrey. You've gone too far this time. You're a lying son of a bitch." As Alice reflected, "I came unglued. I totally lost it. I hit him, I slapped him, I kicked him, I pulled his hair. I did everything I could to hurt him." Alice herded their children into the truck. She was going to live with her parents. Susie also got into the truck with her 2 children. Jeffrey rushed up to the window of the truck. Alice said to him, "When you move that whore into the tent tonight, have her bring her own pillow. I'm taking mine." Jeffrey's eyes were reportedly welling up with tears. Alice remembered Jeffrey saying to her, "You're wrong about Kathy and me. Alice, you're the only woman I will ever love." With that, she disappeared in a cloud of dust. Jeffrey announced during scripture class that Kathy was his second wife from that day forward. Since she had been Keith's wife, Keith wasn't exactly thrilled about this. His feelings mattered not to Jeffrey Lundgren, however. Jeffrey even said to him with the .45 conspicuously displayed from his belt, "Do you have a problem with this?" Realizing his life was at stake, Keith didn't raise objections. He did, however, remind Jeffrey that he promised he would not make Kathy his wife. Keith said to him, "How can any of us trust you if you lie?" Jeffrey said, "I didn't lie. Kathy was never your wife, never married in God's eyes. If Kathy continues living with you, you will both be guilty of adultery." It was vintage Jeffrey Lundgren, using his revisionist interpretations of the scriptures to justify taking Kathy as a second wife. Keith discussed it with Kathy privately. Though she wanted to be with him, she was convinced that she was flesh of Jeffrey's flesh. The false prophet had usurped Keith and the 4 sons he had with Kathy. Jeffrey devised a plan for what the group would do in the event that the helicopter returned. He and Kathy would retreat deeper into the woods. Rob, Damon, Greg, and Debbie would accompany them. Dennis, Tanya, Keith, Danny, Richard, and Sharon would remain in the original camp. Ron, Damon, and Greg were to remain close to Jeffrey as his, quote, 3 witnesses. He appointed them as such, just like Joseph Smith Jr. had with 3 of his associates. Jeffrey promised that God would give him a set of golden plates, and they would be there to bear witness. A sheriff encountered the group. He asked them why they were camped out so deeply in the forest. They said it was related to their religious beliefs. The sheriff reminded them that the children were required to be enrolled in school by West Virginia law. He left shortly thereafter. Jeffrey called Alice and told her he would drive to her mother's house soon. She was not only over her anger, but she reacted like a schoolgirl, running around the house joyously. When his arrival was imminent, she put on makeup and adjusted her wardrobe to look as attractive as possible for him. When he showed up, she ran out and threw her arms around him ecstatically. She even arranged with local RLDS fundamentalists to outfit Jeffrey with a place to teach the chiasmus technique. One thing that put a damper on the occasion was what Jeffrey said to her in private. To quote Alice, Jeffrey said that he had gone up on the mountain in West Virginia and God had appeared and told him that he wanted Jeffrey to take a second wife. God had made a book appear and it had come down out of heaven, and God had showed him the name of his second wife in this book. Her blood was boiling. To quote Jeffrey, "She hit me and threatened me. I'll turn you in right now. I'm going to call the sheriff on you. I'm going to tell about the Averys," she said. Then she asked me if I knew who it was, meaning my second wife. And I said yes. And she said, "Do you love her?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I'll kill it. I swear I'll kill it. Who is she?" Alice was serious about her threat, so I refused to tell her. Alice's input. Who else could it have been but Kathy? After all, it was her vagina that he had seen in his dream. Jeffrey and Kathy went to a township called Kingsville. There, Kathy had arranged for a friend to facilitate one of Jeffrey's lectures. One of the attendees described Jeffrey as a, quote, wild man. By that, they meant someone who hadn't been civilized by soap and water. He wore a dirty shirt. The shirt was half unbuttoned. His face was sunburned. His hair was dirty, greasy, and matted. It was hard to sell him as a prophet when he looked like a vagrant. He told the students he had seen both God and Jesus Christ. Usually when someone who looks like that tells you they have met such deities, they are a paranoid schizophrenic, or at least they come across as deranged. At the end of his talk, Jeffrey appealed for donations so he and his band could leave West Virginia and settle in another state. No money was forthcoming. Alice's parents pressured her to tell them the truth about what had been going on in her life with Jeffrey since they had last seen her. Her parents promised to protect her. Alice refused to tell her anything about the Avery murders or any other of Jeffrey's transgressions because deep down she was still in love with him. Relations began to sour back at camp. The group members who were not suffering the absences of their spouses were estranged from them. Jeffrey kept the only heating device in his tent. He ordered the men to get jobs in town because they ran out of money and could not buy food after selling their non-essential belongings. Jeffrey promised after ordering them to turn over their paychecks that he would save for a truck. Leading them along with the empty promises, he would do things like drive Kathy into town so they could have a pleasant meal at a restaurant. Meanwhile, everybody back at camp was subsisting on non-perishable foods. He promised to buy or rent a house big enough to shelter them all, but that remained to be seen. Alice confronted Jeffrey at her mother's house once again about his adultery. He still insisted that the scriptures told him to take on other wives. She slapped him and asked him how many other wives he would accumulate. Alice dug her heels in. She was no man's collectible. This time Jeffrey returned her slap with a smack to the face and a punch in the stomach. She fell to the floor. He slapped her ear so hard it ruptured the eardrum. After Jeffrey returned to the camp, he drove to a site in town where he found a payphone. He called Alice at her mother's place. He offered to apologize, but she could see through him, in the words of comedian Dennis Miller, like used Neutrogena. She just said, "You better get back here right now." As Jeffrey recalled, Alice told me that she was turning me in for the murders if I didn't move back to Max Creek immediately and stay with her. October 12th, Jeffrey decided to move back in with Alice at her mother's place. He sold some of his guns to a pawn shop to finance the trip. He left Kathy back at the camp. Not only was she livid about being abandoned for another woman, but she was left to manage the camp with no money. She convinced a friend who lived in Missouri to transport her and what remained of the group to move in with Kathy's mother. Her friend consented and collected them soon after. October 15th. Jeffrey told Kathy that he, Alice, Ron, Susie, Dennis, Tanya, and their children were going to sleep in tents in the backyard of Alice's mother's house until Jeffrey could find more suitable accommodations. Kathy convinced one of her friends or relatives to let her half of the group stay in an abandoned dairy farm. Ron, Susie, Dennis, Tanya, and their children joined them. They all pitched tents inside the barn. Jeffrey bifurcated his life between the barn and Alice's mother's house. Kathy confronted Jeffrey about her status as his wife. He promised her that he would take her with him to Max Creek, where Alice lived. He had told Alice that the three of them would live together. Kathy was uneasy about it since she knew Alice would be hostile and Kathy didn't want to share Jeffrey. He could usually smooth things over with an artful apology, but their second fiddle orchestra was woefully out of tune and amounted to a cacophony of outrage. Kathy tried to reassure herself that if the situation was God's will, their three-way marriage would be harmonious. That situation didn't make it past the wishing stage. When they arrived, Jeffrey got out of the car and opened Kathy's door for her, something he had never done for Alice. Alice witnessed it, and she was livid. He probably didn't make the situation better when he told Alice to greet Kathy with an affectionate gesture. Begrudgingly, Alice gave Kathy a hug. Later that night, Alice was told by Jeffrey to wait for him. She posed out in lingerie, awaiting him so they could make love, something they hadn't done in a very long time. After waiting for 10 minutes, she went to the room where Kathy was to stay. She opened the door and found Jeffrey kissing Kathy. Alice returned to her room and wept. Jeffrey stopped by her room and said, "Are you all right?" She said sarcastically, "Oh, sure, Jeff, I'm fine. This is my idea of a fun time." As Alice reflected, I could smell the residue of her kissing him. I said, "At least wash her off before getting in bed with me." He got angry and accused me of being rebellious. He rolled me over on my stomach, pulled my gown up over my head, and began having anal intercourse with me. The two women competed for Jeffrey's attention to the point that it literally came to blows in a grocery store. He had to separate them. Despite the constant turmoil Alice experienced while watching him with Kathy, she continued to serve him as her so-called Lord and Master, which included running his bath every night and both washing and drying him. She would even fix meals for him and Kathy if they happened to be eating together. There was more drama over Jeffrey's relationship with Kathy and the repercussions it had on his marriage to Alice. Alice tried to kill herself with a bottle of over-the-counter painkillers. Jeffrey forced her to vomit it back up and got her to calm down by running icy cold water over her and making her take a walk outside. Such was the hold he had over her mind, heart, and soul, that after all the mendacity and infidelity, she still loved him deeply and apologized for what she had just done. She related what happened next. Jeff told me that I needed to be punished. He told me to go into the bathroom and take off my clothes. I did. He told me to lay down on the floor, and when I did, Jeff squatted over me and had a bowel movement on my face. He rubbed it all over my face, and then he turned me over and had anal intercourse with me. After he came, he lifted me up and put me in the tub, and then he washed me very gently. He washed my hair and face and everything. He told me that I was purified now, and I told him that I was no longer rebellious. He dressed me and put a coat on me to hide the bruises on my arms. He told me that he had decided to take me to the barn with him. I thanked him, and he told me that he loved me. Ah, the sweet stench of romance. Alice's mother begged her to stay with her. She promised to take care of her. This was apparently insufficient for Alice. She chose to hop aboard Jeffrey Lundgren's downward spiral. During Alice's last days of residency in the barn, she got to a point where she could no longer bear the sights and sounds of Jeffrey's relationship with Kathy, and she left the group for good, whereupon she returned to her mother's house. Alice wasn't the only group member who left the fold. Richard and Greg were disillusioned upon realizing that Jeffrey was a fraud. They had been best friends at one time, but Jeffrey turned them against each other, sowing distrust. He even claimed to have had a vision where one of them killed the other with a shotgun. Richard and Greg had been paired up with a couple of the group's women as marriages, but they were not in love with the women, and the marriages were not legally binding. Jeffrey and Debbie tried to convince them not to leave, but Richard and Greg saw no further benefit from their involvement, and they were off. Such was the atmosphere of paranoia that Jeffrey created, that Greg checked the rearview mirror to see if Jeffrey would shoot at them as they drove away. Sharon asked Jeffrey if he thought they would report him to the authorities for killing the Averys. Jeffrey said, "If I thought they would, I would have slit their throats." Debbie had relinquished custody of her children to please Jeffrey, and deep down she always regretted it. Inspired by Alice, Richard, and Greg, she decided to leave the family. She left early one morning and called a friend from a payphone. Her friend agreed to help her by picking her up. November 15th, 1989. The local sheriff took another look at Jeffrey's campsite and found that it had been deserted. Law enforcement didn't know where Jeffrey was, and their investigation, after finding no damning evidence of domestic terrorism, exceeded its budget and expiration date, and the case was closed. The sheriff spoke to Kevin Curry again. Kevin Curry pointed out to him that Jeffrey would not have taken the Avery family with him to the woods because he considered them too vile to be left alive. When the authorities questioned members of the family and searched the property, they neither encountered nor questioned the Averys. The Averys simply weren't there. It wasn't just the Averys that had aroused Jeffrey's contempt. As he put it, "I knew as soon as we left West Virginia that my people would turn against me. The Lord was really telling me that it was time for me to start over. These people were too impatient and soft." More rumors were spreading about the comparably decadent lifestyle Jeffrey and Kathy enjoyed, in contrast to that of the rest of the group. Those who had jobs worked to pay for the hardcore pornographic videos that he watched with Kathy at night. His kids were wearing brand-name clothing that was kept at Alice's mother's home so that nobody in the family would know. He told Alice he intended to cut his ties with all members except Ron. He devised a plan to move to California. As Charles Manson would have verified, the climate is much more conducive for laying down roots as a cult in the middle of nowhere. Debbie was unable to link up with anybody she knew, so she returned to the family at Thanksgiving. Still, she was saddened as she contemplated how Jeffrey Lundgren's ethos had affected everybody. To quote Debbie, "All of us had staked our lives on Jeffrey. We had believed he was a prophet, and now we were all beginning to realize that we had been deceived. It was a gloomy Thanksgiving." Jeffrey and his followers were ejected from the barn after the owner found out he had taken a second wife, and the owner was a very pious man with a zero-tolerance policy when it came to polygamy. Jeffrey and Kathy prepared for their trip to California. Jeffrey told the rest of the followers to find places to stay during the winter. He said he would contact them so he could tell them where to send him money. In spring, they would reconvene. With that, he, Kathy, and his children got into their pickup truck and drove away. He decided to drop Kathy off at the home of one of her girlfriends. The children would live with Alice and her mother. The remaining members, Dennis, Tanya, Keith, Ron, Susie, Sharon, and Danny, were not only left behind, but left with nothing. Because they believed in Jeffrey so fervently, they sacrificed money, homes, careers, and more because they supported his cause. Now they were left to figure out how to rebuild their lives. To quote Debbie, I realized at that moment that Jeffrey hadn't only killed 5 people, he had really destroyed all of us too. Our lives were ruined because of this man. Watching Jeffrey drive away, Debbie said, Jeff, you can rot in hell. Ron received some counseling from a mentor in the RLDS church who convinced him that not only was Jeffrey not a prophet, but he convinced people he was so he could exploit them and capitalize on their resources. Ron called Jeffrey at Alice's mother's house and told him he was leaving the group. Susie had also left. It was easy to break ranks with Jeffrey now that they were all scattered. They didn't depend on him in any way, and it meant they could be self-sustaining again. They were falling away from him like dominoes. Debbie decided to quit. Tanya told Debbie during a phone conversation that she had decided to quit after having become disillusioned with Jeffrey. One night, Keith called Jeffrey and threatened to turn him into the police unless he ended his relationship with Kathy by 9 a.m. the next morning. To quote Keith, I told him to be a little rough on Kathy, to tell her that he never loved her and had only used her because I wanted her back, and I wanted her to know exactly what he was. Jeffrey didn't quite sound so confident at that point. He said, Now, Keith, there are other people to consider in this. Everyone has something to lose if you go to the police. Keith wasn't fucking around. He said, Do as I say, because I'm mad enough to do it. Keith said he wrote a letter about the murders, sealed it in an envelope, and gave it to an attorney for safekeeping. That way, if anything happened to Keith, the police would know who to turn to. Jeffrey said, Okay, I'll tell her. I'll send Kathy back to you, but I need another day. Keith said, Just tell her to come home. Jeffrey did not make good on his promise to Keith. The next day, he and Alice packed their bags for the West Coast. Alice left her parents a note that went, We may never see each other again. I'm sorry things turned out this way. Knowing that Keith was on the hunt for him, Jeffrey grew anxious. He had to wait a couple of more days before leaving because Alice's father, Ralph, sold a couple of his possessions, like the ATV. As Alice has pointed out, Jeffrey coped with pressure by indulging in his sexual fantasies. After buying women's garments, makeup, and other paraphernalia, she dressed and made him up in drag once they got to their motel room. He even walked through a grocery store in drag. Later that night, he hiked up his skirt and ordered Alice to perform fellatio on him. That same night, Jeffrey's former followers congregated in Debbie and Sharon's apartment. Greg and Richard also attended. At first, they all concurred that Jeffrey was a con artist. The conversation soon turned to the murders of the Averys. They realized that though none of them pulled the trigger, they were all involved and knowledgeable about the plot and the aftermath of the murders. This would result in their guilt, and there would be repercussions. They all agreed to postpone reporting the murders until they prepared their lives for the legal fallout. Jeffrey, Alice, their children, and Danny Kraft began their drive toward California. Jeffrey decided they would stay in San Diego because of his familiarity with the city due to having been stationed there when he was in the Navy. They arrived on December 14th. Jeffrey called Kathy on the phone a few times and was caught by Alice, who deduced that he was figuring out a way to bring Kathy out to California. Meanwhile, Alice applied for and received food stamps and welfare, part of an aid program set up to help homeless families. Jeffrey ordered Danny to get a job. He developed a theory that he should recruit gang members and bikers to join his flock, since they wouldn't hesitate to kill in the name of the Lord. He continued to use the scriptures to justify his immoral and illegal behavior. In the book of Revelation, the section about the opening of a third seal contained the following sentence: "The rider of the black horse is carrying a pair of balances." In other words, he has 2 wives. Jeffrey interpreted this to mean that he was entitled to have 2 wives, and he didn't hesitate to bring this to Alice's attention. One night, Jeffrey told Alice that she must sleep on the floor for 3 nights in submission to him because it was what God commanded. Sure enough, while Jeffrey slept on the comfortable motel bed, Alice slept on the floor without a blanket or pillow. Alice described how she felt about Jeffrey at that point. "It was at that time that I became completely and totally, absolutely convinced that there was no validity to anything that Jeffrey said or taught. Everything was a lie from the time we had met in college 20 years earlier." The next morning, Alice read Jeffrey the riot act. To quote Alice, I told him point blank that I didn't think he had ever had any revelatory experience, that I thought he'd made up everything in his mind, and that the only God that he listened to was Jeff Lundgren. I began telling him what a lousy provider he had been for me and the kids, and all of a sudden he became extremely kind and compassionate, and he started crying. He said, "Alice, I haven't treated you as I ought. I haven't provided for you as I ought." And he began to beg me for forgiveness. He said, "Please let me make love to you." That was the first time since we had left West Virginia that he had asked to do anything for me. I said, "No, Jeffrey, it's too late." I got up and I walked out the motel door, and he came running after me. He followed me the entire time that I was walking, and he begged me not to leave him. He said, "Alice, if you ever left me, I'd die. You've got to believe in me. You've got to believe I am who I say I am. Otherwise, I can't go on. I need you." Textbook manipulation. Jeffrey would definitely pay a price for abusing the loyalty of his followers. Keith Johnson finally reported him to the feds, the ATF to be exact, that Jeffrey Lundgren murdered the Avery family. The agents contacted the Avery's relatives, who said they hadn't heard from them in months. Dennis Patrick paid a visit to the local sheriff's office to ask for permission to search the barn for some belongings he had left behind. The sheriff mentioned that the FBI was investigating the murder of the Averys. Dennis panicked. An attorney advised him to flee to Missouri. Meanwhile, Dennis and everyone else who had been a member of the group during the time of the murders got together at a restaurant to discuss the development. Keith guided the police and federal agents to dig in a room in the western side of the barn. When they cleared away some garbage that was being stored in the room, some dry chunks of dry clay were spotted, indicating evidence of digging. The authorities, with assistance from the local fire department, began digging in the western room. They didn't dig deep before a pungent stench wafted up from below. It smelled so bad, one of the firefighters had to run outside. A chorus of gag reflexes was heard all around, despite their experience. They dug deeper, and a swatch of denim appeared. They revealed a person's hip turned sideways and facing upwards. A man's belt was revealed, as was a flannel shirt. Knowing this specter was too macabre for the local sheriffs and firefighters, the sheriff called an end to the digging for the day. He would have to call in authorities who had more experience with multiple murder cases and iron stomachs. The sheriff was so disturbed and sickened by what he saw that he vomited and wished he could retire immediately because he dreaded seeing the rest of the bodies. The other officials struggled to fixate on the bodies, especially those who had small children. When the Avery children were unearthed, it was hard to take. The stench was permeating the air more than ever. When little Karen Avery was lifted from the clay, her left foot fell off. To quote prosecutor Stephen C. LaTourette, "When I saw that little girl's foot fall off, I began to feel nothing but pure, unadulterated hate for Jeffrey Lundgren." To prevent more bodily disintegration, the other bodies were placed in body bags before being lifted out of the pit. Deputy Ronald Walters lifted the body of Trina Avery so that it could be placed on a sheet. When he lifted her, her scalp and hair came loose into his hand. At a press conference, Stephen LaTourette was unable to stick to the script of impartial prosecutor. He became quite emotional, saying, "These people are the cruelest, most inhumane people this county has ever seen. They are going to die in the electric chair for these crimes." Danny Kraft burst into Jeffrey and Alice's motel room, announcing, "Dad, Mom, the barn is on television." They turned on the television, and before long, they came across footage of bodies being wheeled away from the barn. An old photo of Jeffrey appeared on the screen, and it was accompanied by LaTourette's promise to make Jeffrey, quote, fry. Jeffrey commanded everybody to pack their bags. Of course, wherever they were headed, it was toward the end of the line. Alice was sent to get another motel room for them. Danny was ordered to stay with her. Meanwhile, Jeffrey went to the motel where he kept Kathy. Alice was beginning to crack. The story of the Avery murders was featured in every news program across America. The stress was more than she could bear. By the time Jeffrey returned, she was hysterical. She said, "I want you to kill the children and me. Do it now, while they are asleep. But kill me first." Jeffrey found it easy to kill other people, but he couldn't do the same to his own children. He didn't want to kill Alice either. She proposed that they send the children to live with Alice's mother, a proposal that was also appealing to Jeffrey. Though Alice's mother was willing to drive out to California to collect her grandchildren, she was intercepted by ATF agents before she could leave her driveway. They had tapped her phone and traced the call to the payphones Jeffrey used. Alice's mother agreed to cooperate with their investigation in the interests of protecting her grandchildren. ATF agents carried out a stakeout of the phone booth Damon was using to call Alice's mother. An agent followed him to the motel Jeffrey and the rest of them were staying in, though he wasn't able to discern what room just yet. Alice asked Jeffrey if he consulted God about whether or not he should kill her. Jeffrey told her he had, and that she should take her own life. The plan they devised was that once the children were gone, Alice would overdose on Excedrin. She wrote a letter to her mother, as Alice recalled. "I told her not to question anything that she had done. I told her that I knew when I married Jeff that he was different from anyone I had ever met. I told her that I had already talked to Chrissy about menstruation. I told her things about each of the children." Jeffrey proposed that they make love. Alice agreed, though she would later regret it. As she recounted, I was on the bed with my head laying on the side, and Jeffrey was thrusting himself into my mouth, and he began doing it so hard that it began to hurt, and I couldn't breathe. I began to gag, and I began to vomit, but he was so caught up in it that he refused to stop until he was finished. I went into the bathroom and threw up, and I climbed in the shower, and Jeff came in and got into the shower, and I said, Jeff, why do you have to do that? Why do you always have to hurt me? And he said, because it felt so good. He began to cry, and he cried and cried and cried, and begged me to forgive him. He told me that he loved me, and there was no one in the world that he loved as much as me, and he was sorry. I held him in my arms and told him that it was okay. When we went to bed, he curled up next to me and said, Mommy, I'm afraid. I said, it's okay, it's okay. And we went to sleep. Damon was spotted by ATF agents entering the motel suite where he was staying with Jeffrey and Alice. Jeffrey went to a payphone. As soon as the ATF agents realized he was the man they were looking for, he was grabbed and pinned to the sidewalk. He was informed that he was under arrest with a gun pointed at his head. Agents burst into the motel room and knocked Alice and Damon to the floor. An agent pointed his gun at Alice and said, Move, bitch, and I'll blow your brains out. Firearms were found in the room, an AR-15 assault rifle, 2 .44 Magnum revolvers, another pistol, and boxes of ammunition. Jeffrey shouted goodbye to Alice while he was in a cruiser. Jeffrey, Alice, and Damon were taken to jail, whereupon they were strip-searched, fingerprinted, and issued white paper suits to wear. During the questioning of Alice, she confessed to what Jeffrey had done. She said, the more Jeff learned, the more he felt he had authority to do things. The more knowledge he attained, the more he thought it made him. The agent interviewing her said, divine? She nodded. August 1st, a jury found Alice guilty of all charges levied against her. August 29th, Alice was sentenced to 150 years in prison for complicity and conspiracy to commit the murders. She tried using battered women's syndrome as a means to get acquitted, but it didn't exactly help her cause when other members of Jeffrey Lundgren's so-called family pointed out in court that she supported Jeffrey in all of his initiatives, including the murder of the Avery family. From the prosecutor's opening statement in the trial of Jeffrey Lundgren. The evidence in this case will reflect that during the spring of 1989, in or near Davis, West Virginia, Jeffrey Don Lundgren turned to a woman by the name of Deborah Sue Olivares and said, you know, death stinks, but I guess I will have to get used to it. The evidence in this case, ladies and gentlemen, will bring home the smell of death. Unfortunately, it will bring it within the four walls of this courtroom. He, through a series of sideshow and medicine show miracles and tortured scripture, set up schemes and manipulated good, God-fearing people in a way that would have made Jim and Tammy Faye Baker swell with pride. Over time, he conned these people into supporting him and his family financially, into permitting him to act out his sexual fantasies, and ultimately in participating with him in the death of 5 people. Jeffrey's lawyers didn't stand a chance. There was too much evidence stacked against him, including witness testimony. It didn't help that he read the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants in the courtroom for most of the trial. Further adding to his poor showing in this case, Richard Brand mentioned that he showed no emotion while shooting the Averys. His lawyers called the court's attention to the fact that Jeffrey's parents allegedly emotionally abused him and that the RLDS itself led him astray. This argument did not sway anyone. He was not called to the witness stand, and his attorneys did not call any witnesses. The damage had already been done, and it was irrevocable. Jeffrey Lundgren was found guilty with very little juror deliberation. He was found guilty of 5 counts of aggravated murder and 5 counts of kidnapping. September 19th, Jeffrey was given an opportunity to address the court during the sentencing phase of the trial. That statement, "I am a prophet of God. I am even more than that. Much, much more." He read several verses of scripture, mentioning here and there patterns and chiasmus he had discovered. At no point did he express remorse for killing the Averys. He said, "Prophets have been asked by the Lord to go forth and kill since the beginning of time." He ended his speech by quoting the Book of Mormon. "Repent, ye, repent. For the kingdom of God is close at hand. Prepare ye the way of the Lord." The jury took less than 2 hours to recommend the death penalty for Jeffrey Lundgren. Damon Lundgren was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the killings. Most other members of the group had charges reduced or dropped to some degree in exchange for their testimony. Ron Luff was spared the death penalty, but was sentenced to 170 years in prison. Danny Kraft was still under Jeffrey's spell and defended him to the court, saying he was not a false prophet and he didn't regret supporting him. October 24th, 2006. After a years-long process of appeals and other delays, Jeffrey Lundgren was executed via lethal injection. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.